And we're recording. All right. Welcome back, everybody, to week 2, lecture 2, technically month 2 of critical doxology and time energy seminar. I want to hit on a couple of points of order before we get into it. And first is to say, I'm sorry that we didn't have a discussion last time. Instead, you got a bonus lecture, right? Because the time that I would normally have held the discussion section, which was the third Sunday of the month, I was giving a presentation for Philosophy Portal. Show of hands if anybody saw that lecture that I gave them. Philip. No one else? Okay, guys. I consider it canon at this point. Like it really is a, oh, there we go. Theo saw it too. It's a part of this course. It is a part of this course. It didn't happen in this course, but it's kind of like, here I was talking about critical doxology and time energy. But what I didn't do, what I failed to do with the first lecture in this course was basically like, just assume you know absolutely nothing about time energy, you've never heard of it before, and then give a sort of intro lecture on time energy itself. So that's why I took the opportunity to do this concept cave with Cadell last at Philosophy Portal. And in that sense, I think that it was a great success. But normally we'll be having our discussion sections either on the first, third, or fifth Sunday of the month. We're going to play it by ear here. I think that this one we're going to have be the first. So first Sunday of March, which is next Sunday. So we'll all have our discussion next Sunday. That's where we will get to share about, like, have you been paying attention to what kinds of activities can potentially give and or take energy, right? Was there another variation of that question? I feel like there was a more complicated variation of that question. It might have just been something like, what's a way that, is there an activity that can give you energy for a different kind of activity that isn't just work? Is that what it was? Let me know, guys. I got that wrong. Can you close that window, by the way? That there's something really loud and mechanical outside of our window. All right. That was the first point of order. The second point of order is about the reading prerequisites, or like, did you do the reading? That kind of question, right? Kareem says, I think it was what we need to do beforehand. Okay, Theo said, the assignment this time is very simple. I want you to think about what kinds of activities give you energy as opposed to what kinds of activities take your energy. Not only what kind give versus take from you, but also, are there certain kinds of activities that are preconditions for other activities that give you energy? I couldn't have said it any better than my past self, I guess. Thanks, Theo. Fantastic. You did it. I can't believe you pulled that out from somewhere. Do you have like a transcribing thing? Just taking down everything I say? All right. If so, that's awesome. And so as far as the prerequisites and or monthly readings, my big thing that I wanted to say to everybody is just like, you're not expected to have done the readings. Right? So, I put chapter 6 on there. You're not expected to have read chapter 6 of Division 2 of Being in Time. So, I hope some people feel relieved, but there's probably also at least one of you who's like, son of a bitch, I actually did it. Yeah. Wukas. Fuck. I hope you'll do the readings, but I also, I'm assuming that you haven't done them because of time energy lack. And the point is to kind of give you an introductory sort of survey of what I take to be an emerging field with all of these different elements in it. And this is not a course at a university that is accredited where you need to be prepared by the exam date. This is a cohort wherein if you want to do research with us, I'm showing you what the prerequisites are. So insofar as you get invested, and you really want your contributions to be substantial and make an impact on the development of this field, then you'll want to do these readings. But in some cases, you might not feel too inspired on the first pass, or maybe you start reading it and you fall off pretty quickly. The point is to make it so that you'll feel comfortable kind of picking it up, reading a few pages, going, oh yeah, no, I'm not feeling it today. And then later, after the lecture, maybe you go, oh, that's what that's for. And oh, now I get it. And then you'll tackle it head on, right? But if you don't, it's fine. It's totally fine. This is not the point. So that's the second thing. So the first thing was the discussion. The second thing was prior readings, not necessary. Really, when in doubt, just stick to the Timenergy book, right? Like that's the simple, easiest to get through. And it is kind of like the baseline. As soon as you see something like Chapter 6 of Division 2 of Being in Time, just, you got a week, go for it. Or at least, you got 7 hours and you're feeling like you really just want to sit there and force yourself to do something, then yeah, go for it. Finally, the last thing I want to say before Anne comes up here is say that what I forgot about last time when I got up on the whiteboard here, I remember I came over here and I was like, but what's the point? Like, what's the point of time energy theory? Not just time energy theory, but also the critical doxology aspect of this course. And I believe it was Ken, could have been Kareem. Was it Ken? Who had said...
Kerem.
It was Kerem. Kerem said the good life? Is that what you said,
yes.
Kerem? It
yes.
is. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So is Kerem. Not Kareem. My God, I'm sorry. Kerem. Okay. He said the good life. And I was like kind of blown away that came up as fast as it did, because in the course that I'm teaching with actual freshman college students, it's like you can fish for a long time before getting to the question of the good life. But no, I mean, obviously it's something we talk about here. It's something we care about. And so it comes up, and ultimately that is the thing, but it goes beyond that. And I wanted to just say a few things about why it goes beyond that. And that is, when we think about literature that we like or don't like, we tend to approach these things from the standpoint of children at a cafeteria table. We were subjectivized through a schooling system. I say we, I wasn't, but most of you were. And being subjectivized through a schooling system means that you had to figure out who you were vis-a-vis a whole slice of the human population, or like, a portion of a slice of the human population that is basically within your age range of a couple of years. And of course, none of you know who you are, and you're trying to figure that out. And so what do? You form strong identifications on pretty arbitrary things like taste. This person likes country. You like, Marilyn Manson or Eminem, right? Harry Potter or 1975 or Harry Styles or whatever. The point is like these superficial identifications become the most real thing to you at that age. And it's not really who we are, right? Well, so I distrust when people really care a whole lot about music genres. I distrust when people really think that music is like the most radical thing, because it's like, yeah, as a teenager, of course you felt that way, but also we're trying to be adults here, and music and also the way that peer groups segregate and then identify within the schooling system is all part of getting out ahead of any kind of broader solidarity between people, right? Especially within the working class. This is all stuff that I think I touch on in my book, but I also get into it in the Timenergy book, that is. I also get into it in the Underground Theory volume with my piece, Lefter Than Thou. Okay, so setting all that aside, that kind of lays the basis for what I wanted to say, which is that we're all niche weirdos. Now, you can say, speak for yourself, Dave. I'm not, I mean, everyone that you're here on a Sunday and you're here for what's going to become a lecture about Henry Ford, followed by a lecture about Martin Heidegger. The only thing in common between these two guys is probably anti-Semitism. Okay. Like, why in the world would you be interested in these guys, or much less whatever the hell we're up to? Well, it's because you're not normal in any way, shape, or form. But I mean, I think that's good, right? Now, Mandy had said something about how she's interested in, you know, our entire approach to this kind of material because she hates this kind of literature. That is this sort of self-help business success stuff. And I'm assuming most of you do as well, right? And she was talking about how she's into fringe shit and she's into fringe science, and maybe we should do fringe science next. That's similar to when somebody heard me talking about critical doxology and he was like, oh, I want to do a critical doxology of metal. Or when Mikey recently was like, oh yeah, well, you know what, critical doxology would also include, you know, these kind of mainstream political, you know, opinion piece books, right? Okay, well, metal and fringe science and politically partisan, like, you know, super dyed in the wool, you know, confirmation bias industry kinds of books do all in some way, shape, or form carve up or exemplify, maybe exhibit what we would call common sense. And so in that sense, maybe it can work for critical doxology. That makes sense, right? My point is simply this. Why choose the self-help and business success stuff alongside all of this time energy research? It is because I take that to be where people are most sober and most serious. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to learn how to reach out to people who've been sold on Rich Dad, Poor Dad and the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. No, fuck that. I'm not trying to reach out to shit. I don't give a fuck about any of that. And that's everybody thinks I'm trying to reach all the normies. No, I'm trying to train myself to be able to write to normies in the future, but not normies that have already been through a pipeline into idiocy. I'm talking about getting out in front of that pipeline for a new crop of people who are coming in to something. Basically, every day, there's a revolving door. Every single day. There's 8 billion people, and really we should probably limit it to the English-speaking world, kind of what we're thinking about right now at least. And there's a revolving door of people who are falling off and getting back up. They might be going through divorce, bankruptcy, all kinds of crises, right? They might be in a hospital. They might be getting out of prison. They might be in recovery. And it doesn't matter what kind of music they listen to or what their fundamental metaphysical beliefs might be. It doesn't matter if they are Democrats or Republicans. It doesn't matter. The point is insofar as they're like not like us, as long as they didn't get into like high theory, then the chances are when they're trying to get themselves back up, there's a kind of literature they turn to, and it's written for them regardless of where they sat in the cafeteria. That's why I want to go there. Metal music is for one kind of person who sat in the cafeteria. Okay, maybe there were a couple different tables and maybe there's a split over different kinds of metal, because obviously metal gets as niche as humanly possible. It's like the most, it gets nicher and nicher and nicher than any other kind of music potentially. I would say fringe science, this is the same, you know, fringe science and big ideas and psychedelics, and it's all fascinating stuff, but it's not where people tend to go to when they're trying to put their life back together. Now, you could say, well, I don't care about people who are trying to put their lives back together. That sounds like some secular Christian hangover, Dave. or holdover. And you know what? Fair enough. And there's no reason that you actually have to take it that seriously. But that's what that's what that volume is going to be about. It's not what the Timenergy notes volume will be about, though. The Timenergy notes volume is not the critical doxology volume. There's two separate volumes here that we're talking about. And because you're in this seminar, you're kind of being prepared for one of either of those two volumes. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to say, is that part of this is retraining myself how to think with, to, or communicate with, or to people who are not like us. And that was ultimately what I'd said at the beginning of my previous book, Waypoint. In the introduction, I said that I was giving myself 5 years to train myself to be able to write to the parents of my ultimate audience, who will be 25 and 30 years. And I just did this as a sort of heuristic for getting myself to give myself the time to work through the things I think I need to work through in order to develop this theory and my own ability to write to the kinds of audiences that I have in mind, and not just a bunch of anti-capitalists on the internet, right? And I know at least half of you probably already knew that. I know at least half of you, if you didn't know that explicitly, you probably already kind of got the vibe. But that is a big part of, what's going on here. And so I just wanted to kind of say that, because that's kind of like that's outside of like the good life itself, which is the driving question and sort of issue at stake. The sort of other thing here is like learning how to take theory and apply it, not just to doxological artifacts, but also using those doxological artifacts as gateways to being able to communicate with basically anybody you'll meet in an AA meeting. Boom. That's it. So with that, I'm going to open the floor here to Anne Snellgrove, our doxological instructor of the year. And also, I don't know if anybody noticed, but we're kind of taking a break from the self-help business success books. We're not trying to get through as many as possible, as fast as possible. The autobiography of Henry Ford is super relevant for a variety of reasons, I think, that will make themselves clear. But I'll just kind of set it up by saying this. The question, I say the overarching question of today, is why is it that when we try to save time, we lose it? And the harder we try to save it, the faster we lose it. All right, put your hands together. Welcome, Anne.
Okay. I'm excited. I'm excited about this one, everyone. I really never imagined in my whole life that I would be excited about Henry Ford's autobiography. Hold on, my hair looks great. Whew. Okay. I think I actually... No. Okay. So, over the last week, I have listened to the entirety of Henry Ford's autobiography and reviewed it. Reviewed some of the standout parts. And oh boy, I told Dave, I said, I'm a Fordist now. No. But the most interesting thing that came out of this book that I think really, brought this realization within me, okay, I need to read Capital. I really want to understand capitalism and the history and the involvement of capitalism, because in listening to this book, it's like, you know what? I would live under Ford's vision of capitalism, because it's actually, pretty, fair. It's pretty decent. He says, labor and capital need to work together, and profit's not bad, but profit shouldn't run the world, and we shouldn't have too much profit. And I'll get to a really interesting story that he told about profit and wages. but my excitement is hyperbolic. It was just so interesting, the ways in which I could potentially argue that, in his own words, right? This is his own autobiography, so obviously it's gonna come off as like great. But even just in the ways that he's talking about how he pays his workers and how and why the assembly line should run, and how and why we should continue technological innovations to make the workplace more efficient, relates so well to this topic and to time energy in general. I mean, I would argue that if Ford were alive today, he'd be here in Theory Underground going, yeah, I support time energy. Probably not. Probably not. Because if he was still a good old capitalist, like, they're way off with billions and billions of dollars that we could never even possibly imagine in our whole lives, like forgetting that we are also human beings. But I think Ford still had a little bit of that, oh yes, the people that work in my factories actually are people, and they should actually live their lives outside of this factory. I would also argue that he's a class reductionist, in the way that Dave kind of talks about and uses, like, the idea of class reductionism is that he does not care. He does not want race and politics in the workplace. He does not want no HR meetings about white fragility. No, you just show up, you do your work, you get your wage, you go home. He really, like, his main focus throughout the book is, making sure that his employees are compensated, and the reasoning behind that. As Dave did mention, this man was a raging anti-Semite. My goodness. In listening to this autobiography, everything's fine and dandy, and he's talking about tractors and cars, and then there's like a section about general ideas, and he talks about war and democracy and electricity, and then all of a sudden, in like 3 paragraphs, he's like, oh, also Jews are ruining the country. Moving on. So for now, like, we can obviously think about that critically in the same way with Heidegger. We go, his, ideas developed into this Nazi ideology and kind of supports the idea of fascism. I think Dave and I, like, want to look into it more, but we read something the other night that said that Hitler had a picture of Ford in his office, and vice versa with Ford, and we can, look at the ways in which the Holocaust happened, and the ways in which these death camps and labor camps kind of ran like a factory, like an assembly line, and so there's some problematic links there. Despite that, though, today we're really just going to focus on the relation to time and time energy, and my new theory that I told Dave about this morning that I'm calling Timenergy. Time plus money plus energy. And how that all relates. And so I think this was a quote in the syllabus, and it's the really most, like, relevant quote within the book to our whole project here, to critical doxology. And he says right in the introduction, "We waste so much time and energy that we have little left over in which to enjoy ourselves." Oh, wow, so he's really thinking about the ways in which modern life, ways that factories and production are currently going, are robbing us of our time and energy to enjoy life, to enjoy the good life. And so throughout the book, there are various parts that support this that I just want to share. And it's interesting, the tension between work and time and energy and leisure that I think Ford talks about, and almost the contradictions. And you go, well, how can both of those exist? Because today, when we think about having our time and energy and working under the current system, especially in the United States, where, Dave and I have coworkers at Amazon who are from all over the world, a lot from Europe, some from Latin American countries, and in talking to them, they all say, like, oh my gosh, you Americans work so much. Like, I worked a normal job in Iran, and I could take 3 months vacation, and that was just normal. You Americans think it's like a bad thing. to take 2 weeks off at a time. And so it's really hard to conceptualize work and leisure coexisting today in the United States, because with how expensive everything is, you're working 40 plus hours just to like barely get by, to pay for your shitty apartment. That like our shitty apartment is not clean. There's laundry all over the place. We do not have the time and energy to put our laundry away, to wash the dishes every day. So we are not like, oh, having leisure outside of work. We're like barely getting by to pay the bills. But in Ford's vision that he sets up of capital and capitalism, these two things necessarily coexist, and business and labor and work should be the basis to help people have good lives and to have time and energy. He says, this is towards the end of the book. So the introduction, if you were to read anything up from this book, I would say the introduction and the conclusion are just kind of these great, grand, big ideas. Here's what I think about it all. And in the conclusion, he says, every man who works ought to have sufficient leisure. The man who works hard should have his easy chair, his comfortable fireside, his pleasant surroundings. These are his by right, but no one deserves ease until after his work is done. And so this idea of deservingness, and he really makes this case that everyone should have to work. We don't do charity. Charity is actually bad. Work is the basis of life. Go to work, you do your duty, you get paid, you go home, and you have a good life. He argues that everyone can and should work, to the point where he even talks a bit at length about like disabled individuals who need to work, and kind of makes his case against, oh, well, what about charity for them? What if we just give them handouts? And he says, no, actually, I think they, one, probably want to work, and two, here at Ford Automotive, I've got, like, he literally looked at every single position and job that can be done at Ford Motors, and he found that out of all these jobs, only this many require, like, a strong, capable body. This many could be done with only one arm. This could be done if you have no arms. This one could be done if you have no legs. This one could be done if you're deaf. This one could be done if you're blind. So he's like, this one could be done if you have mental handicap. So he really is like, everyone can come work at Ford. We shouldn't put the people who are handicapped in the positions that require strenuous physical labor, and we shouldn't put the people who are able to do the physical strenuous labor in these monotonous positions. So he's like, yep, everyone can work, everyone can earn their living, and it'll be great for all of us. But it's not just everyone has to do work for my company. He really talks at length about wages and the role that wages in compensating workers fairly plays, not only to support his original kind of claim in the introduction that, we don't have the time and energy to enjoy our lives, but he really makes the case for why wages should be fair. It's kind of like a moral argument that, they did the work, they should be deserving of this, but then it also, according to him, literally makes sense for his business to pay employees. And I think it's interesting, especially in thinking about, it's like if we think about Ford as kind of the big capitalist and creator of the person who put the assembly line into place, it's like, hey, Dave and I are maybe now working in a warehouse of what could be considered the modern day equivalent, which is like the Amazon. Like Amazon is kind of that big capitalist enterprise. You could say the same thing about Tesla. But it's really interesting to think about this idea of like, paying fair wages and not profiting too much. Like the story I had referenced earlier was there was a point in the year and the profits that the company had made were, he's like, look, profits are good. We need profit so that we can continue to invest in development and tech to better make the factory efficient. But also it's like, the typical capitalist, I need my profits. But there was one year that the profits from Ford were so high that he literally gave back $50 to every single person who had purchased a car that year because he felt like he overcharged them. I'm like, what? Like back then that he wrote this book was published in 1922. So the minimum wage at the Ford factories was $6 a day. And so like $50 for them, getting $50 back for someone who had bought a car is like, okay, that's a nice chunk of change. Thinking about that, like, oh, he gave profits back to the customers because he's like, oh, there's too much profit. To look at today, the, I guess, former Jeff Bezos, CEO of Amazon, has like so much money, $400+ billion that his net worth, that like if he gave me like $5,000, that would change our lives for the next like 6 months. Like, oh my gosh, that would be amazing. To him, it'd be like chump change. And so that was really interesting to look at this contrast. But Ford says, he says that wages must be fair. He says that he who invests his energy and skill, he the worker, invests his energy and skill, and if he makes an honest, wholehearted investment, high wages ought to be his reward. Not only has he earned them, but he has had a big part in creating them. So that's where he really makes the argument that high wages are better for business because not only like business in general, business in the economy, because okay, if my employees can afford not only to buy my cars, if my employees can afford to go to the other local market and buy the goods from this person, then the economy's good. But he did the math and found that paying a higher wage to his workers was overall cheaper for the company because of the efficiency, because of the motivation that it gave to employees to work efficiently, to work hard, to feel some sense of ownership for the work that they were doing. So I think he looked at the difference between minimum of $5 a day versus minimum of $6 a day. He's like, no, actually it's cheaper to pay them $6 a day because of the retention, because they're working harder, because they feel like they're valued. And he said, but that's just my minimum. I do my best to pay them more than $6 a day. And at the time, again, that was like a very good wage. He even says that, the necessary and monotonous labor, not only within the Ford factory, but just in general, needs to be paid well. And I think that's such a contrast from today, even when we look back at like the 60s and 70s, a janitor. We could argue that we need janitors to keep our public spaces or private spaces clean, sanitary, functioning. A janitor could buy a house. A janitor could support his family. The person at the Ford factory who sat there and did the exact same task every single day for 8 years straight could afford to feed his family and support his wife and kids. That is nowhere near the case today in the United States. There are people who work like necessary jobs, who make the grocery stores run, who get the trash, who are, like I mentioned earlier, just barely scraping by. So there's this big discrepancy between, like these PMC jobs that are high paying. If you work hard in school and go to college and get the right degree and go down this track, then you'll be deserving of a good leisurely life with enough money to enjoy some sense of time and energy on the weekends or in your week to be able to afford a 2 week to 1 month vacation. Whereas Ford is saying, no, every single person who works, every job is important in its own way. Every person is going to not only have a different ability in what they can do, but a different desire. He said some people, like some of the employees that I have, just work, they do the exact same monotonous task over and over again, all day, every day, for 8 years, and they don't mind, and they love it. I would say that Ford would probably let his workers have headphones in if there were headphones back then. Because like at Amazon, for example, we're moving boxes, we're wrapping pallets, and they're so like, oh, you can't have the headphone in. But Ford's like, no, some people are going to want to do that and not have to expend this mental energy. Some people are going to want to work up the chain. Everyone should be compensated so that they can live a good life. So I think that is all important. And in relation to this idea of, having the money and the means necessary to be able to enjoy your life outside of work. But according to him, you have to work to then be able to enjoy your time outside of work. Like I had mentioned earlier, the kind of culture of the work, I think, was very much meant to essentialize and make everything very efficient. I think something I'll mention to kind of make sure that everything is tying together well here is, so while Ford, obviously he says in that first line, we need our time and energy to enjoy life outside of work. So he does, in a sense, like value and care about our relative time and energy, or time energy outside of work. He also, and that's kind of what this book gets into in his creation of the Ford company and his reasoning for continuing innovation and all the innovation processes. These were meant to make work itself more efficient, to save time and energy within the workplace, so that, I guess, the necessary connection that he didn't explicitly say is, if you're saving time and energy within the workplace, you have more. Not only do you have the money outside of work to enjoy your time and energy, but you have the energy outside of work to enjoy your time and energy. And so with that, he was very much like, no, work is for work, personal life is for personal life. There's no niceties in the workplace. It's not like he was, at least according to him in his book, he wasn't advocating for, like, being shitty to your employees, but it was just more, no, we don't need to get into personal stuff. If a guy is too sensitive, that the way that someone says something is gonna, like, trigger him in the workplace, he literally says, like, this guy needs to get his stuff together and man up, or he's not gonna survive in the workplace. We're not gonna. So you think about today and the, like, woke capitalism, where not only in corporate spaces, but again, I always go to Amazon as the example, but at Amazon, it's just like, oh, how's everyone feeling today? Oh, answer these questions. Like every day when you log into your scanner, it asks you these connection questions, and they're like, what do you think about this manager? Do you feel like you belong at Amazon? And it's like, to Ford, you go, no, you show up, you do your fucking job, you leave. Like, and that was part of this process to make the workplace itself more efficient. But the main point and kind of the thing that Ford is most known for is this idea of, like, automation, the assembly line, and efficiency. And he's also known for making cars affordable to middle-class average Americans, which is a whole, rabbit hole I could go down. I think it's interesting, his rationale for keeping his products cheap, and all, I think, just supports his overall ethic that people in America should all live good lives, regardless if they're the highest capitalists or the person pressing the button for 8 hours at the factory. So he argues that, we need to continue automation, continue development. If you think that something is as efficient as it can be, you're wrong. Everything can always, always, always become more and more efficient. So the goal is to make the workplace as efficient as possible, to eliminate drudgery and unnecessary labor in the workplace. If we can make the most cars that we can for the least amount, with the least amount of bullshit within our workday, you all are going to get paid better. You're not going to be sore, your life's going to be better, your mind's going to be freed up, and then you're going to go home to your wife and your kids with plenty of money to support you all. The efficiency maximizes the profit so the business can continue to become efficient and employees can be paid well, right? He even later in the book kind of talks about how this idea of efficiency and technological development should take place in other fields, not just in factories or in industry. So, like, tractors and farming was a big one. He's like, look, I get it. We love horses. We think that, or, we used to have these tractors that were so big and bulky because we thought that something needed to be really big and like giant, heavy to be strong. He literally says, but have you ever seen a cat climb a tree? Cats are not heavy, but they can still climb a tree. So now he's like, so duh, something that is just powerful, that can pull a lot of weight, doesn't need to necessarily be be really heavy. So he says, we can apply this to farming so that farmers can save time and be more efficient. We can apply this to hospitals so that hospital workers can have more time and energy. Like, he was talking about how, I think if I remember this right, he helped kind of fund this new hospital that wasn't fully public, that wasn't fully private, but it's like, as the customer, it was kind of the business model of a hospital. And he's like, the goal of the hospital is not to profit. You shouldn't be coming into this field if you're into this hospital if you're trying to make a lot of money. This hospital is just to offer quality service to like middle class people who don't want charity, but who don't want to break, or who don't want to pay an arm and a leg, pay an arm and a leg to be here. Maybe they did break an arm and a leg. At this hospital, he said, each nurse is going to have anywhere from 1 to 7 patients. She'll have no more than 7 patients. He's like, each floor is going to be self-contained in itself. So nurses and doctors don't have to walk up and down the hospital. They'll just be all on the same floor. Look, the hospital is way more efficient now. And so really he's trying to make business and industry the most efficient so that it can be the most profitable, so that it can be the best for employees. And I think that overall his ideas about automation, I think, go so well with kind of things that Dave has said, and I think I just know like what Dave says so well. I just read Timenergy in the last couple weeks, so I don't remember if this is directly in the book or if this is just from conversations that we've had, but we are not necessarily, and I think Dave emphasizes this, we're not just like, oh, we support Timenergy, therefore capitalism bad, socialism, communism good. Because that's another thing that Ford talks about is, he's like, yeah, in Soviet Russia, you have to work so much more. You have to do exactly the job that they tell you have to do. If you have to work more than you want to work, you're not going to get paid well for it. So he makes this case for why his idea and his vision of capitalism is better than Soviet communism or socialism because of the way that work is treated and the way that work is viewed. And so Timenergy is not just like, oh, it's a leftist idea that socialists and communists should uphold, because from everything that I've seen and like the Marxist group that Dave and I were a part of for a little bit in the last few years, like before COVID or during COVID, I think was when we were really involved in this group, is they only talked about work. They only talked about labor and seizing the means of production. Yes, great, love it, I support that. But without actually talking about our lives outside of work and trying to advocate for time and energy outside of work, oh, what, we're just stuck doing more work and now I have to go to meetings outside of work to talk about work? It's like, I am not a worker to my core. I am a person who wants to live the good life. I'm not here to just be thinking about work all the time. And so automation, as talked about by Dave, I think what Ford would support, whether it's under capitalism or communism or whatever political economic system we're gonna have one day in the future, automation is what can free up our time and energy, because it can maximize efficiency to therefore maximize profit, remove the drudgery and the bullshitness of certain necessary jobs and necessary fields, to free those up so that there are less things as a collective society that we need to do to make society run. We all get compensated for that, but maybe we only have to work 20 hours a week. Or I think the Gore's vision is we all have our 20,000 hours of community chores or community necessary labor that we all have to do within our lifetime. And whether we bust it out in the first 10 years and then never have to do it again, or we do a little here, do a little there, or we just work 10 hours a week for however long, automation is supposed to be what's going to come in and free that up. So that is possible. Instead, right now we are seeing both this insane rise of automation and artificial intelligence and people in the United States working more than they've ever worked in their lives for less pay and wages than has ever been known historically. So it's just this crazy contradiction. I'll finish this off with a quote from the conclusion of this book, when Ford says, "The time has come when drudgery must be taken out of labor. It is not work that men object to, but the element of drudgery. We must drive out drudgery wherever we find it. We shall never be wholly civilized until we remove the treadmill from the daily job. Invention is doing this in some degree now." And so I think that little rant about how America has really taken this idea of automation and totally fucked it over for all of us and not actually used it to benefit people. Oh, who is it benefiting? It's benefiting the Bezoses and the Musks, who have so much money that we could not conceivably even think about it. Like, to them, they'll spend $10,000 on a dinner, and $10,000 would change probably any one of our lives right now. So, with that, Dave will come in and talk about Heidegger and a little bit about Timenergy. But I think this book was just so fascinating in looking at this vision of capitalism and this, man who was like, I guess I don't know if this is the comparison that would be made, but he was kind of the Musk of the 20s. He was the Musk of this time. And this was his vision of capitalism. It's like, wow, no, I would live under that capitalism. Now, pulling back again, this is his autobiography, so of course it's going to be convincing and make him look really good. But if it's true how he was running his company, then we can say, oh, there's some truth in that. And I think this is where I really want to understand historically, what happened. He talks a lot about human nature in this book and how, the way that business is going represents human nature, and we can't fully rid greed and the bad things of human nature, of humanity, but we can try. And I don't just want to reduce, the failures of capitalism and the shit that we have to live through right now to just because there were some greedy men. But I really want to understand historically, how did we go from this to where we are today? It's a really fascinating book. I think I've just been really into memoirs and biographies and autobiographies lately. That's part of why I was just into it. I'm just like, whoa, what? He's supposed to be a bad capitalist. He's saying this really great, liberating stuff. And so that's Ford for ya, his life and work. Thank you. And yeah. Cool.
Well, these do work now. So. Thank you, Anne. I feel like I did not expect that Anne's big takeaway from this was I would want to live in that capitalism. I did not see that coming. I really did not. I thought it was gonna be more of just oh, look at this. It's interesting what this guy had to say. And he's arguably a thinker of time, right? So now I don't think that Anne got too into that element of things, but if you actually look up, just word search his so I listened to I listened to, I don't want to say most of it, but I listened to several big chunks of it. But I also did a word search through the whole thing, looking for time and waste and efficiency. And I think that it's safe to say that he had a real hard-on for efficiency, that maybe he cared about nothing more than efficiency, which he took to be the opposite of waste. See, so that's the connection there. Waste not. Well, how do you waste not? You capitalize on every moment of time. This is the interesting thing. He talks about getting off of the treadmill by making the treadmill faster. Now, I don't think that stands alone to make total sense, unless you have already been through the abstract time section of Moishe Pistone's Time, Labor, and Social Domination, or if you're already thinking of capital as a kind of treadmill. But I think it's really interesting. I think maybe we touched on this before. Was it in this class? But basically, no, I don't think it was in this class, but Anne comes out of the International Baccalaureate program, which is the vanguard above and beyond AP courses in the education system today. It's an international, sort of ideal that someone could reach for. But that plus the actual, just the regular classes that she took growing up, she never actually read memoirs, autobiographies, or like really got to know great people from history. She never got to hear their voices, right? There's like this really interesting thing that you cannot summarize a great person's voice and convey that voice. The voice only comes through in actually reading them. The same would be true of both Karl Marx and Adam Smith. And I think that any time spent with either of those two would have a similar effect in the sense that you go, oh my God, these are not just dead names on pages. These are not just summary listicles, fun facts. But like you actually kind of get a taste of the humanity there. And Karl Marx was Adam Smith pilled, right? People say, oh, he's the father of capitalism as opposed to Marx, who's the father of communism. Yeah. But Marx was actually into political economy. You have to be into it in order to work through it so rigorously that you're actually able to sublate it or imminently critique it, right? He read Ricardo and Smith and J.S. Mill, not just once, not just twice, but repeatedly for like 15 years, right? While he was working on the main stuff that went into his multi-volume project called Capital. And what is Capital ultimately getting at? Now, this is not what I want to focus on today, and so I'm going to try to get past this part pretty quickly. But the long and short of it is just that Capital has a positive side. It has a positive side. It is efficient in a sense. It has efficiencies in some senses. Then there's other ways in which it's not efficient. But if all you've ever done is love, stand, support capital, or hate, disavow, scapegoat capitalists, in either of these cases, you're missing the point, which is to kind of understand in its complexity, there are these positive aspects and these negative aspects, and that the positive aspects can work out so that more or less good people, more or less upstanding citizens, more or less anti-Semitic people are able to succeed, and in their succeeding, improve the world and actually provide not just jobs, but good jobs to their employees, right? Adam Smith's, he sees both sides of this thing. Ford, he sees lots of bad jobs and he's like, man, I'm providing good jobs. And it was Marx who develops the understanding of capital that helps us see how, whether your intentions are good or not, whether you think that workers are going to be able to benefit from the way that you pay them or not, whether you think it's going to save everybody time, or if you're just saying that. No matter what, at bottom, it doesn't matter. Like that's what a systemic structural critique of capital is supposed to do for us. So I'm especially excited because Anne's like, now I really actually want to read Capital. And it's like, awesome. That's like, for me, are you kidding me? Like, that's like, it's like Christmas Day over here. I'm like, yeah, that's me. Guys, I don't think we'll have time to read Capital in this course, obviously, but I do have to talk about it, and we're going to get into it a lot more than we are today. So this is sort of an introduction to thinking a little bit deeper about the situation within which we live, which is broadly conceived as, if not capitalist, at least capital is the main driving force, right? So if it's not capitalist, if it's, say, neo-feudalism, well, capital is still the main force, right? Still, its logic is still what must be understood, so that we understand that if Elon Musk got on the radio today and said, you know, guys, I've been thinking long and hard about it. I've read a bunch of things. I watched some BreadTube videos, and I've realized the error of my ways. And I actually think we need to pay the workers more than just a living wage, and we need to shorten the work week, and we need to, and like, let's just say he rolls out the whole Henry Ford sort of vision for his business. It wouldn't matter. Like, we could go, that's really great, man. Good job. You know, we'd clap for him and we'd say, great job, man. Your heart's in the right place. You know, that's Warren Buffett's heart is arguably in the right place, right? George Soros's heart is arguably in the right place. Like, for me, I have no problem saying that probably most billionaires, their hearts are not so much more corrupt than most human beings, right? Like, you know, in the same way that I step on ants when I walk around, but it's not malicious. I think billionaires, they step on us, but it's not malicious, right? Like, it's not malicious. Like, okay, maybe I'm downplaying it a bit too much. I can see Theo's heart rate going up a little bit, so I'm gonna walk it back. There's a lot of them that are vile pieces of shit, absolutely, and they work with the CIA to squash any kind of competition coming from the developing world, and not just competition, but also, you know, democracy or whatever they say that they're actually supposed to be supporting. But capital does have to be understood structurally, so that people know that we're not just out here saying, oh yeah, well, me no likey. But it's interesting. I'm going to pick on Anne for a second. When she's out of the picture frame there. So there we go. Yeah. She said that she graduated high school not knowing what capitalism is, but knowing that she hates it. And I think that that's actually like a part of the reason why, in my conversation with Doug Lane recently on the channel during the marathon stream, we really should not take people's feelings when polled in opinion polls too seriously when they're talking about capitalism or socialism. If people think capitalism is business, but it's got some bad connotations because they've had time with certain teachers who kind of alluded to it being bad, or if they think that socialism's great or bad because they've got some vague sense for something because it was informed in some way, that it was impressed upon them a certain way. Well, we shouldn't go with that, right? Of course, if all you're trying to do is support your agenda, then you'll go to the Gallup opinion poll and you'll be like, see, more people now support this than ever before. Look how many people bought Capital in 2016. Yeah, they didn't read it though, right? They didn't read it. They put it on their bookshelf and they watched a video and then they were like, yeah, I don't like greedy guys. That was their takeaway. I don't like greedy guys. So it's really exciting to meet a capitalist who is not a greedy guy, who's just like an innovator, who's an actual industrialist, right? An entrepreneur, an innovator, an industrialist, not the same thing as somebody who's just gaming numbers. It is different, right? This is why I think it's so easy for Henry Ford to have an axe to grind against, quote unquote, the Jew, right? Because the Jew is, in his mind, the sort of personification of the person who just manipulates money and numbers to make more money. So it's like, oh, these people just manipulate money to make more money. Me, I'm out here actually making something, like he's making spaceships, right? In his time, he's making spaceships. He is not just innovating, he's transforming the whole world and the possibilities for it. And of course, cars save so much time. They save so much time. Pretty soon we'll all have all this time because look at how much time cars are saving. And that is why I wanted to lead off today with Henry Ford. You see how he's a perfect bridge into talking about capital and Marx and everything like that. But I'm actually going to take it into time itself. I want to think about time. The title of today's talk, or sort of theme, at least on the syllabus, is, I think, something like the existential, what is it? The existential phenomenologico structuralist understanding of time, something like that.
Let's see, it's phenomenological, existentialist, and CPE structural precursors in Heidegger and Marx.
Beautiful, thank you. And if anybody was paying attention at the beginning of the month compared to like halfway through the month, some of the readings moved around. I did have John Hagelin's This Life on the recommended readings. I think that it was actually Rich Dad Poor Dad, and then I swapped it out for Henry Ford because I wanted to go more in this time direction, right? And I talked about I think that on the reading list was also like a couple of crucial chapters from the Timenergy book. The main idea being that Timenergy is an existential, which is to say, it is one of the existentialia. Now, that means something to Michael Downs. That means something to Nance and Ann now that they've been through the Being in Time course. It means something to Sue because he was in the Being in Time course. Show of hands if you were in the Being in Time course. But basically, existentialia is the plural of what Timenergy is one of. Existentialia. And it's because of words that are either made up or used in different ways that people get frustrated with Heidegger. Not just the fact that they exist in his work, but because he is, like, as far as the German language goes, which is already kind of a Lego block language, he is like the Lego builder in chief, right? And that's why people resent him. But existentialia, and of course people say, well, no, it's the anti-Semitism that makes people resent him. No, dude. No. Nobody hates Henry Ford as much as people hate Martin Heidegger. And Martin Heidegger said like 3 things about the Jews. Ford wrote 4 volumes about the Jews. 4 volumes. The first volume is like 20 hours long. Okay? So, no. People still drive around in Fords while they say we should cancel Heidegger. Heidegger said a couple passing remarks. Now, I would say that Being in Time is a lot more conservative and reactionary in its as it is, without bringing in that. There is this little element of that, and there's a whole question there, and it's something that was teased out in the Being in Time course, and I'm not going to address it here. So kind of assume that his politics were apolitical, assume that his politics were super crypto-fash in the 1920s. I don't care. That is something that I think I very, very fairly teased out throughout the actual Being in Time course. But I'm going to treat this like an introduction to Heidegger that now sets those kinds of questions aside and just gets into it. All right. So what are the existentialia and why does it matter? Well, he wants to get beyond the subject-object divide. And Heidegger has this sense that it is this divide in modernity specifically, that is one of the big issues of our time, right? There's a little bit of maybe a romantic in him. He sees modernity chugging along with its steam power and now cars and things like this. And he's surrounded by people who are like, oh, we're so modern. We're so over all the bullshit, man. We get it. And he's like, yeah, but you all think of yourselves as humans when, for the most part, you are NPC, which is non-player character, like going along with the flow, just saying stupid scripted shit. And you think that you have a rich, amazing, meaningful life and world, but you fucking don't, right? Now, I'm oversimplifying a lot here, but I'm just saying he sees sad subjectivities. And these sad subjectivities think that they are so powerful and meaningful because they act on a world of objects and manipulate them. But he also sees that those subjects who are acting on the world and reducing it to a bunch of objects and manipulating them are themselves manipulated, are themselves reduced to numbers, are themselves these de-worlded, sad things. And of course, that's the reactionary element. It's just that he believes that people used to be more worlded. People used to have a better sense of their language, of its possibilities, of their history, of their community, right? They used to be less alienated. Now, of course, alienation, I'm just going to go ahead and add alienation up here because it's an alienated subject. And ultimately, being in time is about starting with alienated subjectivity and then working back to its more full possibilities. Philip says, crying about planetary boundaries is one of my favorite things to do on a long drive. Oh, sorry, I'm coming in on the very end here, I think. Maybe missing part of that conversation. Whoops. So, subject, alienated, NPC, scripted bullshit. Also manipulated, right? Thinks that it's got it all figured out. Doesn't have it all figured out. Okay. That's what he's working with. And of course, the starting point for subjectivity and modernity is René Descartes, who used radical skepticism to break away from all of the presuppositions and dogmas of the church and to, I guess, kind of situate a philosophy that was supposed to be able to balance science and religion, supposed to be able to kind of establish like, you guys are over here, you guys are over here, and we can have a friendly relationship or at least tolerate one another. Like he wanted this sort of symbiosis or at least tolerance between science and religion. And of course, his radical doubt project starts with stripping away everything we don't know and then building back up. And at bottom, what do we know more than anything else? We know that we exist. How do we know that we exist? Because we think. Even when you're doubting, the fact that you're thinking says that you exist, right? I think, therefore, I am. And of course, he builds back, but he doesn't build much back. He builds back, but that subject is still so removed from the world around it. And it takes itself to be of the same kind of being as the world around it. In fact, it takes itself to be of the same kind of being as God, angels, trees, rocks. All of these things are supposedly, they have the same kind of being, right? And of course, Descartes, the father of modernity, everybody else after him, like Leibniz and Spinoza and Kant, or, Hume and Locke, like all of them, are in some way thinking off the shoulders of Descartes. And I would also throw Hobbes in there as like a foundational thinker in modernity. His ontology goes really well with all of this, but it's all about atomized subjectivities that are driven by fear and the desire for pleasure. So fear from, desire to, that is the main things driving these little atoms in the void. And of course, that's his basis for why we ultimately all to get together and give up some of our freedoms to the state. But it goes a lot deeper than that. His ontology is amazing, actually. I think it's amazingly wrong, but it's also very useful in various ways. Well, Descartes, like Henry Ford, actually thought that this scientific mathematization of everything human was going to result in freeing our time. He really did. But what did he think time was? Well, he more or less thought time was like space, right? Time is like space. And not only is time like space, but like it's kind of an infinite series of nows in both directions from the currently existing now standpoint. Well, that's also Aristotle's standpoint, more or less, that Aristotle would say that time is the measurement of something going from earlier to later. Time is the measurement of something going earlier to later. This way of thinking about time takes our ordinary conception of time and ontologizes it. Okay? Don't worry, you don't have to write that down. This is all just, we'll be coming back to this throughout this seminar. But that's like the basic sketch. Now, what Heidegger wants to do in Being in Time is show that time is not just the measurement of something earlier moving into something later. The time is actually the horizon of being itself. Time is the horizon of and meaning, potentially, of being itself. Or at least, maybe if it's not the meaning of being, it's at least the condition of possibility for anything that is, or you could say has being intelligible at all. That is to say, you're able to make sense of something, cool, you have time to think for that, right? But most people don't get to Division 2. Most people are only going to, read Division 1 of Being in Time, and then they fall out at some point. I kind of want to skip past like 8 or 9 chapters and take you to a couple of chapters towards the end of the book. And these are chapters that nobody reads. But I can't do that without giving you a quick, unjust, cursory look at worldhood itself. So what is worldhood? Well, instead of subject-object, I'll go ahead and just do the negation symbol for subject versus object within brackets, all right? So instead of subject versus object, we've got Dasein, being in the world, with hyphens between all of those words. Well, why is Dasein being in the world? And who is Dasein? Anne was saying, as we were reading Being in Time at some point, she's like, yeah, I gotta keep reading this book because I want to find out what's going to happen to Dasein. Well, there's a cliffhanger. We'll just put it that way. There's a cliffhanger. What happens to Dasein? But Dasein is the word that Heidegger is using for human being, or the kind of being that humans are. And it's not something that he super well defines at the beginning because he wants to use it as a sort of placeholder. Like, think of algebra, like an algebraic placeholder, right? You're saying, well, whatever this is, we're going to fill it in as we go. And we're going to fill it in based off of what we know for sure. And our deductions, as far as getting to what we actually know for sure, are going to be on the basis of not just the way things appear, but how things must be for things to be able to appear the way that they do, right? So this is a different kind of phenomenology than what most people take it to mean, right? There's a lot more going on here than typical understandings of phenomenology, because it is fine with going beyond appearances. In fact, phenomenology is arguably about a method for going on or going beyond appearances without going into area theory speculation. Like, I think that might be the best definition of phenomenology on the internet today, right? It's a method for going beyond appearances without going into airy-fairy speculation, right? Of course, Husserl is the one who pioneers it as a method, and Heidegger comes in and says, yes, I'm going to assume as operating assumptions most of the stuff you fleshed out over your life's work, and then I'm going to run with that and build up. What is he going to build up? Dasein's being in the world, i.e., the structures of worldhood itself. Now, when teaching this, it's always good to say, like, we're not talking about the world like the planet with the rocks on it. We're not talking about most people's usage of the word world, unless you're saying something like the world of theater or the world of theory, the world of academia, the world of the Amazon warehouse, which is to say that, like, it's a little closer to what people are getting at when they talk about environment as the background conditions of possibility for a person's, like, way that they are. Like, so you have a person, they are a certain way, and you wonder what kind of an environment did they come from, right? You're asking about their world, in a sense. Except that for Heidegger, I think we'll find out that world is something that can be lost. It's something that can be shattered. It's something that, once shattered, Dasein becomes nothing more than a subject. So, of course, he thinks worldhood is in a state of crisis. People existing as individualist subjectivities is a sign of the loss of worldhood itself. Okay, but with all that said, what is Dasein, though? Well, it's being there. What is being there? Where? Or you can also go, it's being. Well, okay, I was going to say here, but the point is that there has a spatial and temporal signification, right? So I'm just going to add spatial / temporal. I hope that you are all looking forward to like an introduction to being in time lecture today, because I've thought long and hard about when am I going to do this? How am I going to do this? There's no way that I'm going to be able to do this. Well, I just said I have to do it now. And so that's why I've been up since 4:30 this morning going over all these chapters. Okay, so being there. What is the being of the there? Now, to start out with, all we have to say is that Dasein is the being who asks the question about being itself. In the introduction, he lays this out. This is why we have to start with Dasein. We have to start with Dasein when we're trying to get to the question of being, right? Let me back up a couple steps. Heidegger is famously trying to understand the meaning of being itself. But he also doesn't think that we're able to ask the question until we figure out how to ask the question. And we cannot figure out how to ask the question until we figure out the formal structure of questions in general, but then fine-tune this question itself to the being who asks the questions. And we have to think about what are its aims and motives. What are the aims and motives of the being who asks the question about being in the first place? Which makes it go from a book where you would expect that it's all just pondering being and sort of airy-fairy metaphysics, and actually becomes the first time in the history of philosophy that philosophy got this rigorously concrete on the human itself, right? Which is to say, the reason he's able to justify going full in on just trying to understand the human, as opposed to trying to understand all of the other problems of philosophy historically dealt with, is because he's like, no, we keep asking the question of being, assuming we know what it is, and then running forward. This is, Descartes thinks that every kind of being is the same. He just equivocates all kinds of being. Well, so what do you do when you've assumed too much, but you don't want to strip away too many presuppositions and you want to kind of just work within where you're at? Well, you start out by saying the thing that is human, that is typically referred to as a soul, a spirit, a rational animal, go down the line of all the different ways of articulating what we are. He says, suspend or bracket out those typical ways of understanding ourselves. And let's just say, for now, we're those kinds of beings who ask the question. We have to confront that if we really want to be scientific in how philosophically we approach this question about being. So we're the one who asks the question. Is that all that we mean by being there? We ask the question. And we're there, man. Well, that's about as far as the beatniks made it. They really liked Heidegger, but they didn't read much further than that. So they were like, dude, we're like Dasein, bro. We're like so being there. Oh, pass the doobie. And it's fair. Like, it's interesting, then they got really into Eastern philosophy. Like Heidegger was their sort of springboard into that. And they were all about being, like just chilling. Like, Byung-Chul Han's Idiot by the River, right? Like that was like, they idolized this idea of, dude, we're human beings, not human doings. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, Henry Ford. I'm not being fair right now. Like, this is not necessarily how Gary Snyder sounded, right? But I'm saying that is where people tend to go with it. In fact, if you hear people who are really into, say, Marx throw Heidegger under the bus, when they throw Heidegger under the bus, they kind of do something like that. Oh, yeah, well, he just cares about being. And then, of course, like, if you actually understand the ramifications of the fact that we keep presupposing what we mean by being when we actually don't necessarily know what we mean by being, then that's kind of deep, actually, because there's not a sentence you have ever spoken that was coherent and intelligible to yourself or others that didn't presuppose and conflate kinds of being. Whenever I see Theo say pew, 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 I'll have to hit the button. That's the new rule. All right, so being there. Now I just have to speed run you guys. Trust me, he's got reasons for a lot of these things, but I'm just going to lay out the structure of the there, and then I'm going to show you how care is central to it, and then I'm going to talk about the structure of care itself, and then we're going to have to talk about how that's all temporal. In comparison, this kind of temporality will be held up against the ordinary conception of time, which is this linear succession of nows. Okay, that's where we're going. So, go ahead and erase what we were doing so far and say the structure of the there. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and bracket out the existentialia question for now. We're going to keep going. Structure of the there. Now, this is my favorite thing. It's one of my 50 favorite things about this book, but it is one of my favorites for sure. And that is that the structure of the there is made up of understanding. Can you all see that? Or is stuff in the way? Can you see that? Yes. Okay. So understanding, there's not room on this whiteboard is the issue. Just remember that says understanding. So I'm just going to cut it off as understanding. State of mind, which is the worst translation in the world, and discourse. All right, that's the structure of the there. But what does that mean to say that that's the structure of the there? Well, based off of what we can know for certain about ourselves without stripping away too much, this is something that we can come to, right? Now that's important. Heidegger's like one of these first philosophers who's like very, very critical of like what kinds of presuppositions you have going into an analysis, while at the same time saying, historically, philosophy has gotten rid of too many presuppositions, right? Descartes stripped away worldhood itself, and all that was left was math, right? I am not at this point in my reading. I'm going to turn my camera off and make some food for work tonight while listening. Thanks, Anne. Anne's making food for us. Plus, this is all recap for Anne. Like, she knows, more or less, a lot of this stuff at this point. In fact, I probably could have quizzed Anne, Nance, Sue, just for starters. I could have put you on the spot and been like, what's the structure of the there? And you might have been able to remember its understanding state of mind discourse. Well, okay, so why is state of mind the worst possible translation ever? It's because what we're getting at is the condition of always already being attuned. Now that's a lot harder to say. And I even had to use like an acronym there, AAB, for always already being, right? But if you take notes while reading Heidegger a lot, AAB for always already being is a good shorthand, actually. It saves you a lot of time. So what does that mean? Attuned. Now, the reason it's a bad translation is because it's not a cognitive thing for Heidegger. It's just as much a physical, embodied thing. It's not just in your head. It's not just in your mind. It's like your heart, and also just like the vibe, the fact that you're attuned to a certain kind of vibe, right? If you were feeling the times during 2020 and everybody was kind of off and you were feeling it too, you're tuned into that because of the condition of always already being attuned, right? Now, some of the moods that we were able to take on, and that's exactly what stems from what we're calling the condition of always already being attuned. Some of the moods are going to be more fundamental for Dasein, whereas other ones are going to be less fundamental. So, for instance, fear, I've got hope, and I've got fear, and I've got anxiety. Well, if you know anything about Heidegger, you know anxiety is going to win out for a variety of reasons that he spends a long time arguing. But the point is that to be in a state of hope, fear, or anxiety depends on you being the kind of being for whom your being is an issue, and it's a question, and you are always already, in some capacity, attuned to some kind of mood. He has put that on the level of the understanding and discourse. Now, no previous philosopher was going to put that on the level of understanding. And they wouldn't have put understanding on the level of discourse. Because discourse, which is with other people, but also it includes language, is typically considered something that's like we get there later. We build back up to that. We don't put that at the foundational level of who we are. The fact that Heidegger has put discourse and understanding on the level of our condition of always already being attuned is actually one of the reasons people think of him as like a father of postmodernism, is because he's basically saying, yeah, dude, like your feelings matter just as much as your understanding. In fact, it's inseparable from your understanding. You cannot, okay, you can bracket out one and you can focus on the other, but at a certain level, they are inseparable because we can't remember a time where one of these ruled over the others. And of course, if you're thinking about a baby, well, there was definitely a time where the condition of always already being attuned won out over discourse in a sort of sense. Though, of course, that baby was around language and was already being entered into the symbolic before it was conceived, right? To go with Lacan, this is where he kind of gets that stuff, right? But whereas you might, of course, understandably think that the condition of always already being attuned for the baby is going to outweigh understanding, right? Because you you don't comprehend things until later, right? Through language and understand. No. Wrong. Understanding is a modal category for Heidegger. And in fact, this is where I need to correct myself and say it's not a category at all. It's an existential structure. Categories are something we assign to trees and rocks and hammers and equipment as we try to make sense of, navigate, and manipulate the world. That's what categories are. And of course, we can categorize ourselves, and we do, but not for this Dasein analysis thing. For this Dasein analysis thing, he's set aside some special terms for us. Since we know our kind of being is different from the tree or the hammer, because the tree and the hammer doesn't have its being as an issue for it, and it doesn't ask the question about being in the first place. So it's not Dasein. So Dasein gets its own special categories that aren't categories, that are like, well, they're called existentialia. There you go. Now we're there. So already you have 3 of the existentialia here. One existentialia, or one existential is understanding. One existential is a condition of always already being attuned. In the Macri and Robinson translation, that's state of mind. And then the other one is discourse. These are existentials. But when you say them in plural form, they're existentialia. Now, these are universal subject, that's a nice slip. Not subject. Universal conditions of possibility for any and all Dasein. It would count across cultures. It would be anywhere, everywhere. Existentialia are for everybody. Existentials, which it's really annoying that they look so similar, but an existential or an existential, I don't even know how to say it properly, but it's got 2 L's at the end. The point is that the existentialia can be modified and is modified. And insofar as every one of us is particular and belongs to a particular kind of context, all of our existentialia have adapted and have taken on idiosyncratic, localized, and specific ways of helping you cope and deal with the kinds of stuff that you got to deal with, right? But what does it mean to say that understanding as an existential is, so normally I say existential for the particular version and existential for the universal version. And so understanding is a universal, and that Heidegger would say all Dasein, including like the most Stone Age or hunter-gatherer types of primordial people, like everybody's got the kind of understanding he's talking about here. We're not talking about math. We're not talking about explicit comprehension. And this is why the baby has it too. Before the baby has entered language, the baby has a sense for possibilities. What does it mean to say a sense for possibilities? It means that you have some kind of an understanding of what's possible and what the possibilities for things might be. Now, let's just say that you're a baby and you're scooting across the floor, and then you find something you've never seen before and you pick it up and you're trying to figure out, like, what do I do with this? But the fact that you're picking it up and that you're kind of like playing around with it means that you already had a sense for the possibility that it could be picked up in the first place. That's not nothing. AI is still stuck on this. AI still can't get over this hurdle very well. This is hard stuff, and babies figure it out at a very young age, but they don't figure it out because they learn something in a schoolroom or whatever, right? Like, no, they learn this because we're the kinds of beings who are modal creatures who always already have some kind of an understanding of the possibilities for any given situation or anything that we encounter. Right? And of course, there might be this level to this where you're just like, well, duh, who cares? Like, of course. Well, the point is that you can be extremely skeptical about a lot of things, like Descartes was, and still know this, That's what Heidegger is trying to do, is show Descartes stripped away too many presuppositions and made the world nothing but inert matter and math. And time was just an infinite linear flow. Well, that's fucking dumb. Like, he thinks that's stupid. So, why? Why is that stupid? Well, I think it becomes blazingly obvious how stupid it actually is. And also, like, not a good way for humans to try to, like, make sense of their lives. When you're reading chapter 3 of division 1 of Being in Time. So if you really just want to get into it, that's where he does it. And this is actually where someone who didn't see the point of all this continental philosophy stuff, who was just super into Marx, who was always like DMing me about a bunch of things. It was chapter 3, division 2, where he was like, my whole life's been changed, man. Now that didn't talk him out of Marx or something. That's not the point. The point is that he was working within this limiting modern notion of the subject, even though he was a Marxist, even though he was trying to do his dialectical and historical materialism. He was working on a bunch of modern presuppositions that have sort of bracketed out, before he even realized it, so many of the things that we actually know about ourselves. We actually know that we're the kind of being whose being is an issue, and that we're different than other kinds of beings because we asked the question in the first place. These things are different, and we have a gut sort of understanding for the possibilities of things. Now, that doesn't mean that we expressly, thematically, he would say, understand them in the sense where we can grasp them and now we know how to manipulate them, but we have a sense for the possibilities of things. And of course, we can flesh out that sense. And how do we flesh that sense out? We flesh it out through interpretation. Human beings are the kinds of beings who interpret. And it is only through interpreting that our understanding that we already sort of had in some sense becomes a specific kind of interpretation, right? Now, think about how different people can think about the exact same situation or the exact same sort of things, right? Interpretation is a muddy, difficult, potentially annoying hassle when you're talking to people who do not use words the way that you use words. Well, what is that? It clues us into something. It clues us into the fact that humans tend to group together with others who share certain assumptions, and that those assumptions are often the conclusions of some kind of a process of interpretation. So let's say that there's probably a generalized anti-capitalism, or at least capitalism skepticism, here, holding everyone together. Or maybe there's an idea that reading is a good in itself, or that exercising your mind and working through difficult ideas with other people is a good in itself. Or like all of these things stacking up on top of, well, those are some things that we all hold together, right? I'm being very general, very vague. At a very general, very vague level, we can all agree. As soon as we want to get into the specifics of what some words mean, it gets different, right? Fucking Swolitariat's here, actually, so I'll call him out. He said in the comment section recently, what did you say? You said that I totally went rogue on Christine Louis de Sully. He said, LOL at Dave going rogue on Christine. Well, it's because she used the word conservative in a sort of negative sense. And I was just like, oh, well, I don't use it that way, but you know, we can use it your way. And then she was kind of, and because I wanted to move on to get to my main questions, but she kind of wanted to be, you know, no, this is what this word means. It's not what I mean by this word. It is what this word means, which is to say these other interpretations are bullshit. And of course, eventually we get to the point where there's a lot of different people and they use words differently, and we just have to agree to use words in certain ways. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to advance in conversations. But the whole agonizing conversation going into like what we actually mean by something is just what we do. It's a thing about people. And the thing is if you don't find yourself having those kinds of conversations where you're tripped up and then what? People are using words different than me? You might be a relatively solitary kind of person, or you might just not get around other kinds of people who are very different from you. Or when you are, you keep your cards close and you stay at the very, very kind of superficial level of conversation, which is what Heidegger calls idle talk, which is the best way to get through the grocery store, right? We're not trying to have deep philosophical conversations over by the sour cream or whatever the hell. Like you're trying to get out of the store, right? And so if you see the neighbor and say, hi, how are you doing? You don't expect them to be like, well, actually, I'm going through a divorce and my kids are mad at me. And no one's expecting that, because if you say, hi, how are you doing? Of course, this is like in the register of Das Man. This is in the register of average everydayness. This is in what Heidegger calls idle talk, which is just a way of passing through these kinds of spaces, right? But if we kind of spend a lot of time talking to people like that, we can eventually have fun doing it, and we can forget that there are deeper possibilities of discourse. Deeper possibilities of discourse. And I'll get into those deeper possibilities of discourse in a second. First, I just got to say, as far as interpretation goes, I'm almost done here, but there's the threefold structure of interpretation. Do I really have to get into it? Well, all we have to say is that we have a foreconception. Sorry, it's called a forehaving. Forehaving, foreconception. No, foreconception is last. What's the middle one there? Does anybody remember off the top of their head? Foreconception. Come on, Nance. Surely you remember what the middle one is.
Was it
foresight.
like foresight?
Thank you, Sue. Exactly. All right. And of course, Heidegger, like all things great in being in time, doesn't come up with this himself. What he's great at is bringing it all together and holding it all in his head. But he gets this from Schleiermacher and Dilthey. And Dilthey and Schleiermacher, well, Schleiermacher is a theology dude, and Dilthey is a philosophy of science dude, right? And basically, what they both do with this idea of the threefold structure of interpretation is to say that on top of any kind of fundamental understanding that a human can ever possibly have, there is always this threefold structure, which is to say, on the basis of having some kind of a sense for the possibilities of a thing, we then find out about the thing with an eye to our basic grasp of what it already was, or that we already had. So we have a sense for the possibilities, and then it is on the basis of that sense for the possibilities that we keep an eye towards those possibilities, which is kind of like saying cherry picking. So let's just say the neighbors move in next door and they look like meth heads because you have some kind of a sense for what a meth head looks like, right? Missing teeth, fucking jerking around as they walk towards the door. And you're like, okay, so you have you have this forehaving. Now, of course, they could have been through all kinds of things and lost their teeth, and maybe they have Parkinson's. So you don't actually know, right? But this is preconceptual. Your forehaving is preconceptual. You have a gut sense that these people, there's something off about them, and you're already kind of thinking tweaker, right? Well, then foresight is the way that you cherry pick from existence in accordance with that sense you already had for the situation. So you see them come home with a bicycle one day and you're like, they're not even riding the bicycle. What are they doing with that bicycle? Like, I've never seen them ride bicycles before. Oh, you see them with a TV. Are they just moving the TV in because they just moved in? Or did they steal that too? Like, you know what I mean? Like, so what I'm saying is that your foresight is seeking to confirm your assumption, right? Well, on the basis of the foresight that has been cherry picking from the data of existence to serve this forehaving, you develop a foreconception. Tweaker, right? That's the foreconception, right? But the thing is like before that word had any meaning to you, you could have already had a sense that there was something afoot. And then eventually when you actually come up with the word for the thing, now you will use that word quicker in the future to label a person who seems off in a similar way, right? This is just the only example that I could come up with because we do live in a neighborhood with a bunch of tweakers. And so I was just like, you know what? I'll just go with that. Finally, we're going to get to discourse. I guess the last thing I want to say about interpretation is that this is all also necessary for thinking about who is the being who asks the question about being in the first place, and what does it tend to assume about itself? So, because we are the being who asks the question about being, what business do we have thinking we can get to the bottom of it? Wouldn't that be circular logic? We can't get outside of ourselves. So how are we going to be able to figure out the meaning of the question of being, much less how to ask the question of being, if we're always already in this circle, right? Well, the answer to how we get out of the circle is to say, you already had an understanding. And it was on top of that understanding that you had your eyesight, as a metaphor, directed towards certain kinds of things, certain ways of being. You were told, that is what we are. You were told it explicitly or implicitly. And it was on the basis of that that your foreconception calcified and consciousness got reified. Okay? So that's to say, like, if we could deconstruct how we have taken ourselves to be, we can get back to our sort of fundamental understanding for our possibilities. That is an operating assumption Heidegger thinks we can get a lot of traction using or implementing. So we implement this operating assumption that, you know what, rational animal, made in the image of God, Homo economicus, whatever. We're going to say there must be some truth to every one of these descriptions of the human, but let's go ahead and just say those are calcified foreconceptions based off of probably a life growing up in a certain kind of society or culture that sees you as a tool for capital, right? And so we're going to go ahead and say, strip aside or bracket out like those things, and let's get back to our fundamental possibilities for understanding what we are, because any way that we have ever understood ourselves at an explicit or implicit level is only one possible way of understanding ourselves. Any interpretation is a possible interpretation that has been made actual, but there are always other possibilities there, right? So, discourse. All I have to say about discourse is that approximately and for the most part, as Heidegger would say, which is just to say, on average, most of the time, we are in the mode of idle talk. Even when we're having a deep heart-to-heart with somebody, chances are we're still playing off scripts, right? Talking is a lot like being a DJ, right? You're sitting there with a bunch of different songs, and then you're going, what would be fitting to play here? So you slap that one on. So a person says, I'm having a terrible day. And you look at and you got the one that says, I don't give a shit. You can hit that one. Or you can put the one that goes, oh my God, I'm so sorry to hear that. Like, what's going on? Like, do you want to talk about it? That one's going to get you a lot further in life. So you slap that one on, right? But you've got other options. But where did those options come from? Well, they came to mind in the moment. Yeah, but where did they come from before they came to mind in the moment? At some point, you got them. You got them secondhand. You've seen other people use them in certain situations. You have some kind of a gut sense for the possibilities of what these different scripts can do. And so you use them in idle talk. And there's nothing wrong with that. And Heidegger's not sitting here disdaining idle talk. He doesn't think that, or idle chatter is another way of saying it. Something that Lacan would later call empty speech. This is not bad, but it does make us forget about our possibles are possible ways of being, which is to say, there's a way of committing to a subject matter and doing everything you can to understand it. And in doing so, also trying to get outside of the prescripted ways of understanding it that you have before. Thanks. Wukas says, I like possibles. And it actually, I keep correcting myself because I think it's a confusing way of saying things, but it is actually like, you can be a Heideggerian and say something. You can talk about possibles instead of possibilities. You actually can. Like, that's legit. I just try not to because I think it's unnecessarily confusing, but I do like it too. Thanks, Wukas. Okay. Well, I just said commitment to a subject matter is a way of getting outside of idle talk. Well, it's because the they, right here, the they here in the middle, the they never commits to anything. The they is always on the go, passing things along in this mode of idle talk. And so idle talk is part of three things that kind of keep this downward cycle going. And it's a downward cycle that leaves us feeling unsatisfied and alienated. And that downward cycle is driven by idle talk or idle chatter, curiosity, and we're not talking about like a deep kind of, curiosity. We're talking about a non-committal. So for instance, someone says, oh, did you hear about what just happened with the Eminem diss track that whatever that dude's name was dropped? And it's like, no, but I'm interested. What? Tell me about it. Well, the point is it's non-committal. It's like, I'm down to hear about it, but it's not like the most important thing in the world. But let's just say that it's 2020 and people are talking about George Floyd protests, racism, doing the work, and all of a sudden black nationalism's brought up and the line is you have to be for it. If you're in a first world nation, especially if you're white, you just need to be for it because you should be for the struggles of oppressed people, and you should be for the liberation movements that are against nation, state, and capital. And so therefore you should be for it. And of course, if you're in this sort of non-committal curiosity, then you can pretty much like figure out what do people say about this. So you can like watch a few different influencers talk about it. And then you pick the one that you're going to go with, right? Okay. Well, because I'm this kind of a person, I'm going to say this about this topic. And you've made up your decision just fast enough to make the tweet before it's irrelevant. Everyone's moved on. That conversation is so last month. You're on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing. Now we're back to revisiting Me Too again. Now we're back to COVID again. Now we're back to, and the point is that the what's trending cycle is always on the move. Now, this is not something that came with TikTok or Twitter. No, this has been around forever. And that's part of what reading old dead people can help us realize is that, oh, this was a thing before social media. Well, this sort of non-committal curiosity, if you followed it down to its root and tried to actually flesh it out and get a solid grasp of it, you're going to reveal yourself to be a weirdo. You're going to reveal yourself to be one of these fringe kids who wants to understand things for real. Like, for real. Most people don't, or at least most people most of the time don't, which is to say, most people some of the time do, but most people most of the time don't care about getting to the bottom of something, which is to say, they want to talk about Ukraine, they want to talk about Palestine, and they want to basically tell you what they've learned to say about the thing. And of course, maybe they're interested in pegging you as some kind of a person on the basis of what you've learned to say about the thing, which ultimately usually just tells you what kind of media they consume. But they're not interested in some kind of like, let's get to the bottom of this thing, right? Okay. Well, the reason that we do this idle talk and this non-committal curiosity is to say that our understanding of most things is very fucking vague, which is why the third factor in falling is ambiguity. So that means that we have a very, very vague notion of things. and a sort of superficial canned kind of interpretation of them. And you see how ambiguity correlates to understanding, the modal category up here, or the modal existential structure up here. Idle talk correlates with discourse, and curiosity in this non-committal way is a kind of being attuned, right? Well, those three things all feed into one another, and this is where we spend the majority of our lives. And so that is, I think, the most important stuff about the structure of the there. Let's see, what time? 12:01? Okay, we got time. I can finish this out. Believe it or not, we got this. Sue says, TikTok has literally become a scapegoat for not being able to stay focused on a certain topic. I know, for real. And there's probably a bunch of people on TikTok talking about that. So, how does this all relate then to everything else you've ever heard about Heidegger and what we're ultimately getting at here, which is existential time? Well, you probably know something, Heidegger, something, death, right? You have some kind of a sense that Heidegger talks about death and anxiety. Sorry, someone raised a hand. Go for it, man. What's up?
I have a comprehension question.
Cool,
Because
yeah.
you mentioned falling, and so is falling the correlation between all these three structures, like understanding, state of mind, and discourse?
No, that's a great question. So falling has to do with idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. And these are diminished, sort of averaged out possibilities for understanding, attunement, and discourse. Yeah. That's a great question. And I like that you clarified that. Everybody, when you have comprehension questions, never hesitate to raise your hand. Of course, like the bigger kinds of questions that can take us into who knows where, those are the afterwards kinds of questions. But no, those comprehension questions help me too. Well, I think I'm gonna go ahead and erase all of this. Take a screenshot if you want to have it handy. It looks like Rudy's taking notes. Theo's probably taking notes. Theo said he's stoked about this, so that's awesome. I'm glad. He's like wanting to dive into being in time, but he's also trying to catch up with CDT and CMT and all of this other stuff. And so who knew you'd get a nice little, prep here. So we haven't actually put care into things yet. And I guess what I mainly want to say about care it's like the fundamental piece here. Oh, thank you. Wukas did it. Thanks for the screenshot. The fundamental piece here is care, which for Heidegger means the way that we project ourselves out onto the horizon of possibilities. Now, care is upstream of, and that is to say, prior to this other word he uses, which is concern. Like, I'm going to go ahead and just do the over sign and then do concern. But concern and this other word, solicitude, are two possible ways of dealing with or sort of like coping with or sort of navigating the world. So solicitude is how we are with others, and concern is how we are with things. So you could think of this as the distinction between I and thou in Martin Buber, right? Who was, by the way, a contemporary of Heidegger's and wrote essays about Heidegger. I don't know if they really understood one another or not. But this idea that people are not things is something that modernity had to keep emphasizing. Modernity had to keep emphasizing it because post-Descartes, there was an explosion of devices, an explosion of tools, an explosion of things. And so we have to like keep reminding ourselves, don't treat people like tools, man. Treat people like a good, or like they're an end in themselves, like what Kant would say, right? Well, and that resonates with people because people don't like being treated like machinery, right? People don't like being treated like an object that is picked up and manhandled, right? So, I mean, Heidegger's working with this distinction as well. So solicitude has to do with being with, and concern has to do with our ready-to-hand involvements. Ready-to-hand involvements. What does that mean? It means that until just now, every time that I've picked up this dry eraser and used it on the whiteboard, I was not thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about this as an eraser. I wasn't thinking about, no, I was thinking about what we were talking about, right? Heidegger would say I was de-severing the subject matter that we're working through here, which is to say, I was bringing this subject matter close to us. And it was what I was talking about, at least for me, I don't know about you, but at least for me, what I was talking about was closer to me than this dry eraser. This eraser was kind of the furthest thing from me, in the same way that you can be wearing glasses and you forget you're wearing them because they're so close, right? Well, in the same way, we are always already in the world, immersed in projects, always projecting ourselves out onto the horizon of possible ways of doing things. We've developed habits doing so to the point where we don't even realize we're projecting certain possibilities that are excluding other possibilities, right? And our ready-to-hand involvement with things is this sort of like subconscious way of understanding how to use them, right? But of course, anything that is already in ready-to-hand involvements with us can also be understood as something that is made present at hand. And so this is something that you might not know much about Heidegger, but you might know this about him. Present at hand. This distinction between ready to hand and present at hand is a really good one. I'd love to break it down and just go with it for the next 2 hours here, because we could. But for now, I'll just, say, suffice it to say, ready to hand is how you use the hammer when you're not thinking about it. And present at hand is how you're looking at the hammer when you're comparing it against another hammer, right? As a commodity. Present at hand is also how you look at the hammer if it's broken and you're trying to figure out how to fix it. Science tends to deal with things in this present at hand manner, because the moment you're trying to understand something, which is to say, interpret it for him, the moment you're trying to interpret something as precisely as possible and explicitly as possible, you're doing so in a present at hand way, which means that you're not using it in this ready to hand way. Now, if you're in the workshop and you're building something for a house, most of the stuff you're operating with is in this sort of ready to hand relation, but it's not you as a subject who is acting on a bunch of objects in a sort of subconscious way. No, these are not objects. They're tools, and tools have their own kind of being. Tool being only exists because they are in a referential totality to one another, which is to say, the hammer signifies nails, the nails signify 2x4s, the 2x4s signify saws, the saws signify trees understood as potential wood. There's all these different things that are sort of presupposing one another, and they all point at each other. And so the way that all of these things point at one another, he talks about as the in order to, and the towards which, and the for the sake of which, and the fundamental involvement. And the point is that in a referential totality, you've got all these different kinds of assignments and references, but these aren't pure relations. I mean, they are relations, but they're not pure relations in the way that semioticians talk about the relatedness of signifiers to one another. Because Heidegger says, that's too flattening. That's the kind of flattening, this pure relationality, is the kind of flattening that removes the assignment context of the stuff that is ready to hand from its involvement character in the first place. And when that worlded stuff in the workshop gets flattened, all you have left is a bunch of present at hand stuff. Now, you might still be able to make something of it. You might still be able to, conceive of something or invent something, especially if you kind of understand the workshop anyway. And that is because we have a circumspective concern with the background conditions of intelligibility for the projects that we take on. And that circumspective concern is kind of like your background awareness. And so you have like this background awareness of all of the shit. Okay. God, this is all of Division 1 in one lecture. Don't worry about it. And so we're concerned with things as ready to hand or present at hand, right? We're not concerned with people usually as ready to hand or present at hand unless we are capitalists who are treating them like tools, or unless we are, psychopaths who are manipulating people, or if we are, there's some level of like that, I guess, just we live in capitalism. We do have to kind of think instrumentally sometimes in a way that concerns other people. But for the most part, people break through, and we tend to we treat people different than we tend to treat hammers and stones. Concern is how we deal with hammers and stones. You either are concerned with it or you're not. And it's either in the foreground of your concern or it's in the circumspective concern, which is to say the background. Okay. But my point is that solitude and concern are both on the basis of care. And care is structured by the fact that your own being is an issue for you. So I'll just put own most being. That's just some Heideggerianese. That's the way he talks. Own most being. Your own most being is the ultimate for the sake of which. For the sake of which. I put FTSW because I don't want to have to sit here and write out for the sake of which. But that is to say that the hammer is in an assignment context in order to hammer a nail. And the nail is in order to secure the boards. And the boards being secured is in order to make a house. But the house, its ultimate for the sake of which is shelter. And then you say that's its fundamental involvement. The fundamental involvement character of the house is, or, primordially at least, is shelter. Well, what is our primordial or fundamental or original or, strip everything else away? What's that basis for us as our ultimate for the sake of which, our fundamental involvement? Well, it's our own most being. It's the fact that we can die. It's the fact that we're trying to make something out of this life that we have while we're here. And that idea that we can die is more important than the fact that we do die. And it's wrong to say we. The moment you say we, you're kind of like doing an escapism and not confronting what Heidegger's trying to talk about, which is radically singular. I die. I can sit here and say you die, but that doesn't, no, you have to say it. I die. And it's not that you inevitably are going to die and then you're either going to live forever or get reincarnated or there will be you will exist no more. None of that matters for Heidegger, because what matters is the necessary, we use the box to symbolize necessary, the necessary possibility of no more possibilities. This is a fundamental concern, but it's a concern that goes beyond things and how we use them or manipulate them or fix them or dismiss them or get them out of our way, the necessary possibility of no more possibilities is the basis of care. And it's why Heidegger's going to think that our fundamental mood orientation at the end of the day is anxiety. But it's not anxiety how people talk about anxiety today. It's a little bit more like depression than it is like how people think of anxiety today. It's a little bit more like depression. And it's really just like the realization that all of this shit is meaningless. Like anxiety is not just doing, it almost doesn't help to think of it with that word, right? What he's talking about is when everything falls out from under you and you don't have concern for anything, which is to say, normally you're in projects and you're doing stuff. You're building houses, or you're flipping burgers, or you're working on homework, or you've got children to feed, or you've normally got 60 things going on at any given moment, and you're juggling all of those different things. And then sometimes all of those things just fall out from under you, and then you just go, I don't know. I don't even know what the hell. Why am I doing any of this stuff? Like, does it actually matter? And this brings us back to last time. Libidinal energy versus physical energy, and the idea that you can be perfectly healthy, but you can't get out of bed in the morning. It's related to Heideggerian anxiety. So I'm just going to go ahead and draw like a nice sort of arrow going to care, and then it's a double-sided arrow, and on the other side of that double-sided arrow, I'll use orange to write it. I'm just going to say anxiety. It is because once we strip away concern with things and solicitude with others, at bottom, we are always projecting ourselves onto a horizon of possibilities. Understanding, remember, is a modal category. It has to do with what's actual, what's possible, what's necessary, what's not necessary, which is to say, what's contingent. It is because we have a sense for our horizon of possibilities and how we can move through it, that we tend to, on top of that, take on certain kinds of relationships with others and certain kinds of concerns with various things. But when all that stuff gets stripped aside by anxiety, which at bottom is the understanding that there's a necessary possibility of no more possibilities, and that all of this shit is probably fucking meaningless if we actually get down to it, it's because of all of that that care is fundamental. And we cannot understand temporality in a Heideggerian sense without understanding that. I know. Let's talk about like a Russian doll. We're just going to sit here and unlayer forever. But we're getting there. We're getting there. So finally, I got to talk about the existence, facticity, fallenness thing. So in the same way that you have understanding, the condition of always already being attuned, and discourse are all equally primordial, equally original, none of them comes before any of the others, then we have to say, similarly, there are three other existentials that are equiprimordial. Oh, by the way, all of the things I keep putting on the board here that are specific to Dasein are existentials. Care is an existential. I already talked about understanding, attunement, discourse. Yeah, well, same with fallenness, as you're about to see. But basically everything I keep putting up here is an existential. I don't think ready to hand or present in hand is an existential, because there's structures, existential structures, and then there's actual modes of being. And ready to hand and present at hand are two of the primary modes of being that humans in any culture are going to be able to experience. You will have ready to hand relationships with equipment. It's guaranteed. All humans do. You have ready to hand relationships with your feet, right? So insofar as a person is running around with their feet, they learned how to do that at some point, and they're not thinking about it anymore. And that's because they have a ready to hand relationship with those bodily appendages, right? Well, it's sorry, I'm sitting here trying to clean this up. It's a mess. I realize I'm like talking about these two modes of being, and I don't want you guys to like go out into the world and think that Heidegger is saying that there's two modes of being, readiness to hand, which is the fundamental one, and then there's present at hand, and science, and honestly, most of the ways that we encounter things when we're actually, making them thematizable or something that we can articulate and talk about with others as present at hand. No, that's not the point. That is what most people run with, and it's wrong. Because there's a third mode of being, which is the fundamental mode of being, right? The first mode of being is the one that requires those other two modes of being. And it's called existence with a Z. Existence is a kind of being or a mode of being that is projecting itself forward onto the horizon of possibilities, just like the word care, right? Just like the word care. They go hand in hand because Dasein is its existence. Its essence is its existence. But when Heidegger says that, he's not saying what Sartre's saying, or maybe it's related, but you should probably think about it different. To say that your existence is your essence is to say that how you have been projecting yourself and how you can project yourself onto the horizon of possibilities, that is your essence. Not the what, not the substance, but the form. It's not the how you've done it, but it's the that you are always already doing it and you're going to keep doing it. I could drop this microphone and walk over and just unplug the computer and never go on the internet again. I have that capacity. And that capacity is on my horizon of possibilities right now. And I'm not going to do it. I'm going to finish out this lecture. But like, you could get up and leave, right? Like you can do anything. So it's like, it's not that I choose to keep lecturing that is the most interesting thing about humans. It's not that you're continuing to watch that is the most interesting thing about you. No, the most interesting thing about Dasein at bottom is that we're a modal possibility temporalizing kind of being, which is to say we have a horizon of possibility on the future, and it is only on the basis of possible ways of moving forward that we have already seen or heard about or thought about that we are able to project in the first place. Which is why history matters. History matters because it is only on the basis of ways that we have been that we're able to project ways that we can be. And of course, we could say, well, no one's ever done this one thing. In fact, people have always done this other thing. So I'm going to do the opposite of that thing that people have always done. Yeah, but you're still doing that on the basis of your conception of what people have done. And so the point is that any way that you want to take over how you project is going to require some kind of a sense for how things have already been and what the possible ways of moving forward actually are. That actually helped me skip right into the area of this lecture that I wanted to be in, which is that as opposed to linear now sequence time, we have this other kind of time where we are, I'm going to go ahead and just remove all of that. So linear now sequence of time versus existence. Or we can spell it with the Z. It's the same thing. Existence, facticity, fallenness. Now, we already talked about fallenness. It's the idle talk, ambiguity, and curiosity cycle. But existence, facticity, fallenness is what he calls the care structure. It's the structure of care, which is to say, these three things make up care. Now, I already said that care is this modal projecting, which obviously also relates to the understanding, right? Facticity has to do with this sort of blunt fact that you're here. This blunt fact that you are in the century that you're in the year that you're in the family that you're in. If we talk about like John Rawls's like natural lottery, well, the way that all the dice ended up rolling in your case, that is your facticity. And of course, it's not just you, it goes out beyond you, because some of the most interesting facts about you, if somebody was writing about you 100 years from now, is going to require a lot of context about where you're at right now. And of course, to you, you're walking past things and people and the things that people say and stuff like that. You're not thinking like an anthropologist or a historian. There's going to be all kinds of things that in the future, someone who's writing about you is going to have to go, okay, folks, but you have to imagine when they were doing this thing, this is what the world was like. Okay, well, that's all facticity too. That's facticity. All of that shit is part of your facticity. So existence has to do with our projection onto the horizon of possibilities. Facticity has to do with the blunt fact of what it is, of where we're at, which is something that, Rene Descartes strips away in his meditations, but it's not something that he strips away in his discourse on method. When he's trying to sell the public on the idea of science and philosophy, he actually uses his own experience and talks about the town that he grew up in and what life was like and all of these idiosyncratic particularities that resulted in him getting into the things that he got into, that resulted in him becoming a genius polymath, that resulted in him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like Descartes understands facticity is important, but it's like, not when he's doing these Cartesian meditations, right? Not when he's stripping away everything. Fallenness, we already got into it. So why do these three things go together like they're all one thing? I said that Heidegger's, playing with German language, which is already the Lego block language, right? And to put existence, facticity, and fallenness together, sure, it's frustrating for people who are trying to wrap their head around what's going on. But once you actually get how these things fit together, and then you say, this is the structure of care for Dasein. You got to think back to what was the structure of the there, right? Understanding, state of mind, or attunement and discourse. Well, those things go together with the structure of care in a really interesting way, and ways that we could tease out for hours, and I'm just going to have to skip over a lot of it to simply say, when you start thinking philosophically, it's already too late. You don't get to get out behind your facticity. You don't get to choose to have not already been in the fallenness of, which is to say, like, your average everyday way of being for your whole life growing up was pretty much this superficial curiosity, idle chatter, and ambiguous way of talking about things that makes it so that you never actually have to commit and get to the bottom of anything. By the time hormones are raging through your body and you're probably going through puberty and you're actually going to start kind of rebelling against your facticity or saying, you know what? I'm fucking tired of the way I've been projecting my existence. All my choices I've ever made have been my teachers and my parents. I'm going to do my own thing now. By the time you want to do that, you've already been inculcated into this facticity. You were thrown into this facticity, and you've gotten normalized to the fallenness, which means that the way you project yourself out onto the horizon of possibilities is already this canned scripted shit, which is why when teenagers try to rebel, it's funny to adults, right? And of course, nothing fucking pisses off a kid harder than that. Like, oh, no, but I really mean it. Like, the thing is from the teenager standpoint, you always assume if they don't take you that seriously and think that you're just going through a phase, then you think they just think you're not sincere or that it's not truly authentic, right? And then you're like, you double down on it and go, no, man, I'm the real deal. This is really who I am. I'm choosing this. But of course they know just because you're not choosing mama and papa or the teacher's possibilities doesn't mean you're not choosing possibilities that were laid out for you by somebody else probably a corporation. Right? So you went and bought your authenticity at Hot Topic, or you were too poor, and so you put a bunch of safety pins in your hat, and now you're like, I'm different. I pierced my own nose with I did at one point. Who gives a shit? It's fun, it's interesting, but it doesn't, if the thing that you're really going for is authenticity, no amount of sincerely saying, well, I chose this, actually gets you out of the fact that what you chose was from a bunch of options that were a part of facticity and fallenness. Right? You don't, in taking this is all about taking ownership in our lives. This is about taking ownership, because by the time that you are realizing, oh shit, I do things that I'm not proud of, or I've done things I don't want to do again, or, oh, they keep telling me how to be, but I've never chosen who I want to be on my own. At the point that you think that, it's too late, man. You've already been inculcated into this thing. And even though you're going to say, no, I'm going to go do something wild, something nobody would ever think of, somebody thought of it, or you wouldn't be able to buy the ticket to go do it. That's the point. Now, that doesn't mean you can't be authentic. Heidegger does think that you can be authentic. In fact, this is a major point of contention between him and Adorno. Adorno thinks there's a cult of authenticity after Heidegger and Kierkegaard become popular. And of course, he thinks it's just a bunch of jargon. It doesn't get at anything real, but it gets at something real. And Adorno is just wrong on this. Not only is Adorno wrong on this, I would say everything he makes fun of is something worthy of making fun of, and that Adorno is correct in all of the stuff he makes fun of in the jargon of authenticity. But what he never actually approximates or actually gets is actually what he's arguing against when it comes to Heidegger himself, which is, yes, we all experience this. At some point we go, I've just been kind of going along with the flow. And most of the choices that I've made were false choices. And I've never really chosen my existence. And my existence is my essence. And I might fucking die. And shit, I got to actually make something of my life. That's real. And you could say that that's not real, but like, come on, there's something to that. And that's worth thinking about. And that's what Heidegger's getting at with this structure of care. Okay. Well, that gets us through being and time division 1. Now we're going to skip over division 2, chapters 1 through 3, where we get into the way to be authentic is basically through this understanding of the necessary possibility of no more possibilities, coming to terms with it and taking ownership over how you project, and then running forward into danger and just taking risks and doing like what you think is ultimately something that only you can do after everything else has been stripped away by this sort of acid bath that being unto death actually is, right? We get to skip over all of that and just say, this existence, facticity, fallenness thing is temporal. That each of these existential structures is temporal. And how is it temporal? I know, because this is where we get into existential phenomenological time, right? This is the whole point. I had to say all of that to get us here. I really did. And I'll hopefully be able to revisit important elements of it over time. Maybe you'll rewatch this in 2 years and you'll understand it all and you'll be like, I fucking get it now, dude. And you'll probably be able to go further with it than I have. Hopefully. Okay. Well, for now, existence is always directed towards the future. As a existential structure, what we mean by existence is projection onto a horizon of possibilities. So obviously, it is a future forward-facing kind of structure. And so the way he says it, I have to keep looking at my notes here because this is a little foggier for me, but it's the always already ahead. So I'll just put the AA there for always already ahead of itself. Now, because Dasein is not necessarily a she or a he, we say itself, which is unfortunate because obviously an it is not the same thing as a thou, but whatever. We could say thou self. Always already ahead of thou self. It doesn't work. Anyway, Dasein is always already ahead of itself. And what does that mean? Well, there was a point in this lecture when Anne started preparing food for our work tonight. Why? It's because she's always already ahead of herself. And part of being already ahead of herself is going, fuck, I don't want to be hungry tonight at work and then have to eat the whatever the hell they're trying to sell me for $5 off of the snack shelf, right? I have, throughout this lecture, had an eye to the time and to what I have to get through. And that's the way that I'm already ahead of myself. If you've got stuff later today or in the week or in the month or in the year or in your life that has definite dates or deadlines, or you don't know when it's going to be, the point is that is a way of already being ahead of yourself. You're ahead of yourself. And those are explicit, but there's also implicit ways of already being ahead of ourselves, because we are in going and doing X, also assuming that we're going to do A, B, C, and D, and we don't even think about the fact that we're doing all of those things, right? As Nance always says, it's like we're not doing long division most of the time, right? So, we're not consciously. We're not doing long division. So, existence has to do with the future, which is always ahead of itself. Now, this is more fundamental. This truth is more fundamental and certain than anything that Descartes develops in the Meditations. I think that really matters. I think that's really important. Because if you've learned to think philosophically, you've learned to be critical, you've learned to suspend operating assumptions and or presuppositions, and you want to get to the bottom of like what's most certain, if you've ever been through those kinds of not just thought experiments, but really if this has become a way of life for you, the fact that we are at bottom always out ahead of ourselves is a crazy way of talking about temporality, and it's more true than saying that we have a future, or that time is something that moves from earlier into something later. What about facticity? Facticity is pretty easy. It's the always in. Always already in, right? It's the situation you're always already in. And that's obviously the present. So I can just put present down here. And fallenness, which is to say, yeah, I like the way that I wrote it here. We're enthralled with things. Oh shit. I'm sorry. Someone should have told me that's obviously not the present. No, the always already in has to do with the past. So I totally fucked up. Makes more sense now, right? Yeah, because you're thrown into the world. This is your situation. Yeah, your situation has a history. That's the point. And then fallenness is the now. And it's the being enthralled with things. Stuff. And then I would add circumspective concern, readiness to hand, presence at hand. I'm just doing the initials of all those things because I don't want to write them out. These three things not only go together, but are the actual structure of temporality itself. We just don't normally think about it this way. But there's a reason why most of the great thinkers of the 20th century think you have to contend with being in time. And that's because there's a sort of like deliberate thinking that is so careful. Bye, Sue. There's a sort of deliberate thinking present that sets a new model for how to approach things. And so, of course, most of them get excited after chapter 3 and they run off and go do their own thing without even getting through the chapter. But there's some real fucking gold here, and I don't think you really get to appreciate how good it is until you get to Division 2. And so I'm glad I gave you all like this sort of 1,000-foot view take on being in time. Now, with this idea of temporality, what can we do with it? I don't have to be on the whiteboard anymore. I can actually just set up my microphone and close this lecture out. Okay. Well, it gets juxtaposed to the ordinary conception of time. The ordinary conception of time, once again, is that time is what's counted from earlier to later, right? It's the now, and then it's now, and it's now. And then we could say, well, the past is like nows that are no longer now. And the future is nows that aren't now yet. And clocks and calendars are how we measure how far away we are from the nows that are no longer now, and how we try to estimate certain nows that aren't yet now, like how long until we get there, right? So we have to be at work at 3 p.m. today. Well, for us, that means that we've got X amount of time until that not yet now becomes now. This is the ordinary conception of time. It's in Aristotle, it's in Bergson, it's in Kant, it's even in Hegel. Now, Hegel's going to bring in this way that there's the negation of the negation, and spirit and time fall, I think it's like spirit falls into time, and there's all this stuff. And Heidegger's got a problem with it, but he doesn't go too hard on Hegel, because ultimately he just spends enough time to say, look, you're not going to get what I'm giving you in Hegel. You're not going to get what I'm giving you in Kant. You're not going to get what I'm giving you anywhere else. Nobody else has thought about human possibility, which is to say modality, within this temporal frame in this way that is existentially based. Arguably nobody except, of course, Husserl did do it for him. Heidegger just integrates it with the Schleiermacher, the Dilthey, the Kierkegaard, all of the existential stuff. So it's like existentializing Husserl is ultimately what is original here in Heidegger. So this existence that is always already ahead of itself is also always in a relationship to death, because we all know that we're going to die. But the way that we deal with death in fallenness is to say, yes, everybody dies. And someday I also will. And even I'm afraid of death, or I'm not afraid of death. But whatever kind of opinion or script you kind of play off about death, it's never really real. And here's a couple ways that it's not real, is saying, I don't believe that there's life after death. Or I believe I go to heaven after I die. Or I believe I'm reincarnated after I die. All of these are ways of dismissing what's most interesting about death, which is that we fucking don't actually know. We actually don't know. And that's where Heidegger stands, because at least at this point in his work, he is one of the most serious atheists in the history of philosophy. Right? And so for him, death is not about the facticity of dying itself. It's about the facticity of that necessary possibility of normal possibilities, which is on the future. It's the not yet. It's a not yet now, but it's always on the future. And because it's uncomfortable and people don't really want to look at it, Heidegger thinks this is one of the main things driving fallingness into theyness. This whole this sort of, let's just talk about everything in terms of the generic third person peer and kind of equate ourselves with the generic third person peer. It is on the basis of that theyness that we're able to come to this idea that time exists outside of ourselves. Because if you die, well, then we will all ostensibly keep existing, right? Well, what if we all die? Well, there'd be other people still. So this is the idea of public time, which is like this weird sort of we just kind of imagine this other thing, right? And then we measure it with clocks. But of course it gets at something else, which is arguably that the universe would keep moving even if there were no humans in it, right? And that movement would itself be time, right? Well, yes, at a certain level, in a certain kind of sense, sure. But also, that's a kind of flattening that removes everything else we've put on the board. Everything else we've put on the board gets at, we are more certain of our necessary possibility of no more possibilities than we are of the actual reality of Mars, or of the inevitable heat death of the universe, or of the Big Bang, or of the... No. What we can be certain of is our facticity, our existence, our fallenness. These are fundamental. Sure, we can go off of that. There's something here. So what? Does this leave us with like some kind of a project that says, look, you've always just gone along with the flow. Now it's time to just be yourself, bro. Dye your hair blue and do whatever you want. Heidegger doesn't think so. Well, remember that he writes this in 1927. The stuff that I work out throughout the entirety of teaching this is that he is dealing with the fact that they had just lost a war. And he's trying to figure out how we're not going to lose another war. And we need a new theory of what it is to be human. And we need a theory of what it is to be human that's not going to just put us on a platter and serve us up to the enemy next time. That is going into this. There's a reason that he's reading radical conservative journals in this decade. And I say radical conservative, of course you might just think, well, that's just fascist. Well, Junger was arguably pretty fashy for a minute, but he was less so later, but he was also really never a Nazi. And there's just like this whole question with all of these guys, same with like Spangler and all of them, where it's like, I like to just use the catch-all of conservative radical because it kind of catches the gamut, where obviously fascists and Nazis are in there, but you also have all these people who were like against the Nazis, against the fascists. But what makes them radical conservatives is that they think that tradition itself is not worth conserving because the tradition itself is so far gone. And they're not trying to repeat something that's in the past, but they think that the past has something to offer that they can use to make something their own, and that they basically don't have their own world right? Which is all fine and dandy as long as you like de-ethnicize it, de-nation state it, right? So I mean, there's stuff in here that you can take out of the way that Heidegger is thinking it and still find it useful. But where you do get the little red flag, or at least swastika flag, throughout this book, is the ways in which in chapter 5 of Division 2, he's going to bring in historicality as a fundamental existential structure of Dasein. So after all the stuff on anticipatory resoluteness, he's going to bring in historicality, which is the fact that we can be historical. We can make history. That's not just writing it down in history books. That's like doing something that matters and actually dying for it. And that it matters more than your life. The fact that we can do that is an existential structure of Dasein. And so most people, if they make it to Division 2, they don't make it past chapters 2 or 3. And so, of course, they're just kind of left with this idea that by anticipatory resoluteness, which is like you realize what your own most possibilities are because you've gotten over everybody else's, and then you commit to that and you run forward without fear. What they're missing is chapter 5, how this structure of temporality that I laid out behind me is only the beginning. The next part of it is to say that we're historical beings. We make history. And he said that just because people can go for 1,000 years without making history, without doing anything worth noting, doesn't mean that they're not Dasein or that they don't have historicality. They're just in a deficient mode of historicality. Right? Just because your town or your family or your country or your whatever generation, just because it is a big flopping nothing burger, doesn't mean that it doesn't have historicality. It just means that you haven't actualized any historicality. You haven't actually made history. You haven't done anything worthy of note. It is on the basis of the fact that we're the kinds of beings who are able to do something worth repeating or talking about how it happened for thousands of years that is the precondition for writing history. Historicality is prior to writing a history book. History books wouldn't matter if it wasn't for the fact that we are historical in our nature, is ultimately what he's trying to say there. And of course, he thinks that they're living in historical times, and it's obviously true, right? Okay, well, I can get into that. That's a whole lecture, though, and I've already given it in the past. But for those who've never cracked the front page of Being in Time, or who tried a couple of times and got thrown off, I hope that this sort of broad sketch gives you a sense for where we're going. I'm going to close out with an idea that is ultimately the reason I wanted to give this lecture, and that is that there is an inauthentic way of being in temporality and temporalizing oneself, and there is an authentic way of being in temporality and temporalizing oneself. And I think for Heidegger, it has to do, this authentic kind has to do with trying to figure out, like, what is your facticity? What have you been thrown into? What possibilities that have come before you really do sort of set the parameters of possibility on your horizon? And being historical in that way is going to be an important piece of the puzzle. And that's, obviously potentially problematic in all these different ways that we can get into. But it's also just true. Like we do navigate time through possibility, and our sense of what's possible is informed by our sense for history. But inauthentic time, Heidegger says, is the state in which we say, I don't have any time. It's the state in which we count time and measure time through like this sort of mentality of scarcity, where we're constantly going, where did all the time go? And there's no more time for things. And he thinks that that kind of scarcity mentality about time falls away and gets replaced by this sort of overflowing fullness when you know what your real priorities are and nothing else matters. The reason there's no time is because you're in ambiguity, curiosity, non-committal curiosity, and idle talk. And you want to know everything about everything. You care about chasing everything down, but never getting to the bottom of it. And you've habituated yourself to this. So of course there's no time to do anything. You're trying to do everything, Dave. Look at you. You want to play the fucking violin. You won't shut up about it. You want to go on bicycle rides and slackline and do jujitsu and run marathons and also do philosophy, but not just one philosopher. You want to do all of philosophers, and you want to. So of course you're thinking about time energy and how we don't have it because you live in theyness, Dave. You live in theyness. And everybody else who's interested in time energy, who's finding anything that I find convincing, part of the reason that you're finding it so compelling and part of the reason that you think we don't have any time is because you are, like Henry Ford, convinced that if we're just more efficient, then we would just get more time and then we could do all the things that we want to do. And Heidegger's like, nah, bitch. Wrong. Sorry, it's not going to work like that. Your own most potentiality for being in the world, whatever it actually is, if it really is, and it really is like it's possessed you now, everything else is going to fall out. There will be no, oh, I'm distracted because of TikTok. I'm distracted because of YouTube. I'm distracted because of TV. I was going to do that, but I got a phone call. I was going to do that, but I got a notification. I was going to do that, but then I had to go to work. He's going to be like, no, dude, you would fucking quit your job and you would get after the own most possibility. and everything else will fall out. And of course, what he's thinking about, I think, reading into the text a little bit, is running into gunfire and doing everything you can to protect your nation so that you don't lose the next war, because that's what he was prioritizing in the background while he was writing this. Now, if that's not the most important thing, if you're a bit more like Badiou, it's the idea of communism. For Badiou, he basically agrees with all of this and then just says, yeah, but it's the idea of communism, not the idea of the nation state. Well, what if you're not a communist and you're not a nationalist? Well, what then? What other possible ways might we do it? Well, these are questions for us to figure out. Now, Mandy was really good when I gave the lecture on the chapter where he's talking about authentic versus inauthentic time. Mandy was really good at pointing out that this is classist as can be. Heidegger's always had his time energy. Yes, exactly. But also that means that he was free from preoccupation with drudgery. Someone like Henry Ford wasn't free of preoccupation with drudgery, so he mastered it. And you can only master it by becoming a capitalist. I mean, there's no other way out unless you come from old wealth, right? Well, Heidegger comes from old enough wealth and has the pedigree and sort of privileges that come with the kinds of university positions he was able to secure for himself, that he was able to have relative time energy, large energy-infused repeatable blocks of reliable time throughout his week, so that he could become a theorist of time, but never of energy. Energy. Absent in everything he writes. Just like Aristotle, whose entire condition of possibility was a bunch of slaves doing the manual labor in the background while he was thinking. Just like Kant and Bergson, right? Just like Descartes, who said that, well, but you know what, if we unlock the power of science, we could have 1,000 devices. He said, the direct quote is an infinity of devices that would be labor-saving devices. That's what Descartes thought unlocking science would bring us. Now, of course, that's a potential I think that we all kind of hope for, and that's why Anne brings Ford's aspirations to conquer drudgery back to automation, which he was already thinking of at the time. Philip, I don't know what that means, man. Jocko pill? What's that mean? So Mandy's correct. There is this classist element, but also that means that he was outside of the thing that we're inside of, which is time energy lack. That means he had relative freedom. We don't. So instead of just calling him classist, I want to say, what was he able to presuppose? What does leaving energy out of his entire equation, not to mention labor power, actually do to his entire project? These are things that I want to be, and that I have been working out in my own work, as well as in the Being in Time lecture course. But with that said, I don't think that Heidegger would have said that there's this kind of inauthentic time that without experiencing it himself. So just because he had his relative time energy does not mean he didn't experience inauthentic time. It's not like he had time energy wealth and otium for his whole life, and then he just saw other people complaining about how they don't have time, and he was like, oh, stupid peasants. No, I think, he's clear. You can never be fully authentic, and you're always going to fall back into theyness. And something that I started saying a lot during the lecture series on Being in Time was that every time you go back to sleep, you wake up again forgetting everything you learned the previous day. Like, if you have a good day, it's like you figured out what you need to do in life, and then you go to sleep and you wake up and you forgot it all, and it's like starting all over again, right? Heidegger fell off the horse. He would get to work, he would get after the things that he thought were the most important, and then he would fall off of that as well. Even though he had his otium secured by a political economic structure that was able to make it so he didn't have to do any kind of menial or even stressful work. It's because you get looped back into distraction. You get looped back into what's going on, the trendy things that people are talking about. You get looped back into all kinds of things, right? So what I'm thinking is so interesting here is the idea that how we think about time, or how we count time, or how we tell ourselves that there is no time, can actually not just become a self-fulfilling prophecy, but accelerate the degree to which we don't have time. And I've been experimenting with freeing myself from wage labor over the last several years, and there's been multiple times where I've been able to get a few months away from wage labor. And I'll just kind of coast on my savings and try to do all the things that I thought I was going to do. But then I didn't have that work structure, and I ended up like, oh, I'd sleep in longer, and I just kind of like feel like shit and fucking, I'd try to do things, but my motivation would fall out from under me. And of course, there's this idea that, well, maybe that was a lot of libidinal energy that was coming from my drive against work that had me wanting to do all these things that weren't work. So that's first. And that's why libidinal energy does factor in here. But it's also potentially because as the person who's trying to, well, first of all, I was trying to write the Timenergy book, but now I'm trying to write the bigger book. Because I'm constantly thinking about this phenomenon, could it be like I'm constantly cursing myself? Like I'm running along, constantly projecting onto my horizon of possibilities, no more time. You don't have time for anything. You don't have time for anything. I think that Heidegger was privileged and time energy rich, but there is this possibility that he's onto something when he says that inauthentic time is like, oh yeah, I don't have time. Well, maybe we're just not good at prioritizing, right? Obviously not. Obviously, capital is going to be like the big follow-up. And so next time, I'm going to be talking about capital, right? I wasn't going to get into capital this soon. I wasn't going to get into being in time this soon. The original syllabus and its entire structure, like I said, don't trust it. I said I've got really big lectures that I want to be able to give in this series. I don't know when I'll feel up to it. Somehow I felt up to this. Hopefully I'll be up to the capital one next time. But the point is, we have to figure out, why is it that when we start counting time and trying to be efficient with it, we find ourselves with no time energy? We also have to think, why is it that all of the technological gains that we've made have resulted in people being more exhausted and alienated than we could possibly imagine? And I think the only real answer to this really is capital. And so that's what we will come to next. Thank you, everybody. Push the button since you're all clapped. Thank you, Swole. I said Swole specifically because I see that he's just out there, like in the kitchen, coupling, like doing things. And to everybody who is like doing things while still following along, big time shout out. Learning to disassociate from what you're directly doing and stay with philosophy in a sort of longer term sustained way is like one of these crazy hacks that Heidegger didn't know about. He didn't see it coming. And so that's why on page 216 of Being in Time, when he says that when you are away from the world of work, circumspective concern from the workplace falls away, but concern with intentional objects remains. And that's why we get handed over to anything and everything, whatever kind of bullshit fallingness we get into. It's because we're used to being integrated into the whole operation, the whole equipmental totality of assignments, and we're just a part of that bigger system, a cog in that thing, right? And we're used to that all being a part of our background awareness, but then when we're not at work anymore, that's not a part of our background awareness anymore. But we're still kind of wanting to keep going. We just don't have anything to keep going with. So we play video games, or we scroll TikTok, or we read crime novels. It doesn't matter. The point is that Heidegger thought that's basically what happens. outside of work, you get handed over to the they. And like, you think it's freedom, but it's the freedom to do everything superficially and never get to the bottom of anything. I said Heidegger didn't see this coming. Well, what he doesn't see coming is that at Amazon, Anne's listening to the Henry Ford autobiography, preparing for her lecture. At Amazon, I'm listening to all of the materials and even my notes from my previous readings to prepare myself for these lectures. That's what he didn't see, is that we could build up a background awareness of circumspective concern in the world of philosophy that goes with us between work and home. There's a little addendum. Theo or Philip, I'm wondering if one of you guys wants to share what that was all about. I didn't actually read it all. What's going on in there? And then we'll take a couple questions and close out. Let's see. So Philip had said, is Dave Jocko pilled? And I didn't know what that was. So he said, wrote the self-help / leadership book, Extreme Ownership, in which a main tenet is prioritize and execute, aka a portal to authentic time. Also loves to say, get after it. I say get after it because of Goggins. David Goggins says that.
I think it's a military thing. He was like a SEAL Team 6 guy. But like his main thing is basically.
And you can't hear Philip right now, right? Okay, cool. Sorry, keep going, Philip.
He has, similar to the Arbeitnachtsfrei, his thing is discipline equals freedom, and that's kind of his cope with, whatever neoliberal lack, of time and energy. And he's also one of these guys who wakes up at like 4:30 in the morning.
Oh yeah.
And it's like, if you wake up at 4:30, you have time for whatever you want. And on one hand, I want to give him his due. Like, he's not wrong.
Yeah.
But I think the libidinal thing comes in, and I think it's also like he's one of these guys who, after 20 years in the SEAL team, is like now starting to do the self-help stuff. So he has like this, he's got like a retirement. He's got like all these material conditions that have created islands of free time. And he's super into BJJ, if you ever want to follow that shit.
Oh, like jujitsu?
Yeah, like big time jujitsu guy.
What? Dude, fuck yeah. All right.
And he's like trying to
I
teach
think
to kids. He's like, we got to teach this to kids, man, so that they can build these skills and learn these disciplines and all this good stuff.
No, man, there's something to that. Anne could probably share out a little bit about that. But it's like there's nothing cooler than the kids that go to our jiu-jitsu gym. Like, there are so many of them, and the parents, I keep talking to the parents are all like, these kids, their confidence levels skyrocket because of what they're learning there. And they're also learning to respect one another. They're like, they're learning how to respect one another, but also find like an appropriate way of unleashing base animal aggression. And if you can't find a way to do that, you become like most internet people, right? Wukas, what were you gonna say, man?
I don't know. This thing about discipline, like it's true. There's a lot to it. That all of this shit from self-help books, which tells you exactly wake up at 4:30, take a shower and shit. Like, it's very useful, but there is a point at which you free up all of this time, you use all of these techniques, and then you don't have anything to fill it up with. But like you just get more bullshit to do, and it's like. This is why I think it's good that you mentioned that Heidegger is right, that you have to prioritize, but also this is not like a solve all scenario or something.
No, if it's a necessary condition for the good life, it's not a sufficient condition. And so then what are the other conditions, right? So Timenergy is going to be a condition. some degree of willpower, probably, even though the self-help industry has kind of corrected for that one. And now they're like, look, power of positive thinking and willpower are not like, that will cause burnout, guys. Like, everyone's warning you that will cause burnout. And it's like, well, why are they warning you that? It's because that's what they used to sell you. And everybody wanted their money back eventually because they burnt out. Right. And so now they're like, habit formation, discipline, micro habits. You do it because you do it, even if you don't want to do it. That's why they say Goggins, you got to listen to David Goggins now. It's because it's even when you don't want to do it, that's the reason you should do it the most, right? Like that's why they bring that in, is because it's not about willpower. It's about accepting a rule on your life. There's a new law, and the new law is you're going to do it. End of story. It's not up for discussion. You might be having the worst day of your life, but you still run in the rain. It doesn't matter. And you know what? There's still something to it. There's always going to be something to it. I'm really interested in this extreme ownership book, though. It is about prioritization. Like, a lot of things come down to that. The new law is fuck Goggins and Jocko. So Theo said. All right. And then who else has their hand up here?
Me.
Karim?
Yeah. You can say Karim if it's easier for you. I had a question earlier, which was about the idea of ready at hand, and it seemed to me it's somehow related to the CMT course and the being on call, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And are we like, is there any way that we are going to delve more into that, or is it not have been done yet in that sense, the relations there?
Yeah, it's definitely not been done in this course. It is something that I am obviously I'm talking about it repeatedly throughout the CMT course, right? So that's because Heidegger says that we're on call, right? As human resources. We think the whole world's on call for us and that we're lords and possessors over nature. But what we forget about is that we're also on call. And then he was saying that before we had phones in our bedrooms in our most private moments, right? Like, so, so of course that's there, but like the phone is working at its best when it's ready to hand, when you pick it up and you start clicking and you're not even thinking about what you're doing, right? And so there's like a whole field of science called ergonomics, right? And the point is to make things feel as friction-free as possible. You know, the Amazon warehouse is proud of how ergonomic everything is because it's super safe. Like, every post has padding around it. Like, people don't get scrapes and cuts on things because they've really thought ahead how to make everything ergonomic so that it's just friction-free. And it's like the science of ergonomics is doing a lot of good and a lot of bad when it comes to smartphones. You know.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
I didn't know about the ergonomics. So.
Yeah, man. Yeah, I don't know if I can say it's a science. It's like I think maybe it's a sub branch of engineering.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
All right. Anything else? Anybody else have anything else before we close this out?
Yeah. I have actually a bunch of stuff, so please cut me off if it's too long. First of all, I'm doing this backwards.
I'm gonna listen while I step away. So I'm listening.
So first of all, regarding this horizon of possibility, when I read chapter 8, is this the way that Heidegger is using aesthetic, like that your resoluteness is aesthetic? Because that was one term I stumbled upon while I read the book. Maybe someone else can help me with the question too. But okay, so there's one question, but since you stepped away, there are two things I wanted to bring up. One is regarding discipline and ergonomics and all this stuff, because at another time we talked about kinetic energy. I think it was in the first lecture we talked about different kinds of energy. And regarding jiu-jitsu, I don't know if you are familiar with Moshe Feldenkrais. He has a method. He's like a guy who he worked together with judo teachers, and he developed a certain idea of moving. Like his whole thinking about bodies is that you are shaped by your environment, but you also develop certain ways of moving. And these ways of moving can actually be not healthy for you. And so he starts by doing like kinetic exercises, which are like he tries to make them as ergonomic as possible. He develops it alongside how babies learn to stand up. Like he looked at babies, and he has a whole. I had it in acting school. It's great exercises because you don't really try to fulfill something. You try to get acquainted with the way you're moving.
What's his name?
Moshe Feldenkrais. I can put it in the forum too.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, that'd be great. Just share it down there. Or oh yeah, actually in the forum would be even better than in the chat. But and I can kind of hear myself is the issue. She's got the laptop in the other room, so I could kind of hear myself. Okay, so no, I don't know about that guy. That sounds super fascinating, and I know that there's something about kinetic energy in jujitsu because like when you drop onto your back, you're supposed to slap the mat, and it's a way of like releasing kinetic energy, I guess. And so that's fascinating, right? When I'm like thinking about people who have done stuff with energy or if I can sit here and say, well, Heidegger never thought about energy. Well, neither did, Wintro or Aristotle or Kant or Hegel or Bergson in any way that's going to be really useful for time energy theory. But of course, what they've done with time, even when they're doing speculative metaphysics, it might ultimately help us in some way. But when I'm thinking about energy, I think of Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Wilhelm Reich, Carl Jung, Arendt, and Deleuze, all as having something important because they're all thinking about some aspect of basically vitality, right? But also most of that stuff is dealing with libidinal economics, libidinal energy. But the thing is there's also this funny thing called China. It's not really funny. It's actually this amazing place that we know nothing about, right? And they have like this rich history of ideas of their own. And in the various approaches that they have to making sense of the human, the idea of qi is actually a very important one in their medicine. It's also very important to Japanese philosophy. They call it, it's basically pronounced chi in either case, right? But it's spelled differently, depending on if we're thinking about the Chinese or the Japanese version. But like the way that like people talk about chi, it is kind of the way that what's his name? Star Wars guy. George Lucas. It's kind of the way he talks about, or like he wrote, into the Star Wars universe, the idea of the Force, right? And I think I got most interested in chi recently because of that interview with Anna Greenspan, one of the founding members of the CCRU, because she's been getting into chi, and she's talking about the I Ching or the I Ching as having it part of what it's getting at is the different kinds of intensive qualities of time. And I was like thinking about that after the fact, and I was like, intensive qualities of time, but chi is energy. Oh shit, there's time and energy. You mean that the only people in the history of philosophy who really thought about time and energy were whoever ultimately contributed to the I Ching? Potentially. It's potential. And so then, of course, I went down that rabbit hole, and of course, I'm like, what is going on in this book? Like, I cannot tell. who knows if it'll be somehow useful to time energy theory in the long run. I don't know. But I'm definitely fascinated if anybody does know about that stuff or has like the thing is I've had conversations with Reiki people, right? They do stuff with chi with their hands. They'll give you a back massage without actually touching you. They'll sit there and just like be really purposeful. It's kind of like Tai Chi, but like a masseuse, like a Tai Chi masseuse using chi to do something to your aura or your energy centers, right? And I tend to disregard any of that kind of stuff. But also, if it's had staying power, this is a basic Heideggerian point. If it's had staying power, there might be something to it. And just because the interpretations most people put on it are bullshit, doesn't mean that if we deconstruct those, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be something there. Like there could be something to it, right? So I'm open to these things. I'm interested in them. And so kinetic energy seems somewhat related to chi. And so, just putting that up for everybody to think about. Let me know what you come up with, or if you think about it or come up with anything. Yeah.
He developed it alongside Chi. He was in dialogue with this judo guy, and judo also leads back to this.
That makes sense. And also jujitsu comes from Japan originally. So what about the first question? Can you give me a refresher on what it was?
Aesthetic, like in chapter 8, he speaks about, I think it's aesthetic
Ecstatic.
or
Ecstatic.
ecstatic. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, he talks about the ecstatic temporal unity, right? And so it's funny that as soon as you asked the question, I was like out of the room, but I was like, a bolt of lightning hit me, and I was like, you mean somebody did that reading? Oh my God, I didn't know someone did the reading. So the ecstatic unity, he calls each of these an ecstasis. The ahead of itself is an ecstasis. The always already in is an ecstasis. And the being enthralled with things, or the making present, he calls it making present. That's also an ecstasis, which is, you could, to use, English shorthand, say past, present, future. All of these are ecstasies, in plural. Well, what makes them ecstatic? Now, normally when people think of the term ecstatic, it kind of brings this connotation of like excitement, and I've heard Heideggerians use the term in a way that makes it sound like Dasein is ecstatic. It's like outside of itself in this sort of like wonder with the world. And sometimes I think Hubert Dreyfus falls into talking about it that way, which is too bad, because the point is ecstasy. He didn't have the word ecstasy yet, but Lacan had to coin the term ecstasy because he didn't want to sound like a Heideggerian after he was trying to move on from Heidegger. But as soon as you start saying, oh, it's extimate, and you have a past with Heidegger, well, we know where you're getting that idea, because it's Heidegger's saying Dasein is not in itself. Dasein is outside of itself, because Dasein's not a pure subject. Dasein is caught up in its worldhood, and its being in the world is this elaborate structure of all of these existentials that I was talking about today, as well as some other ones. And so the point is like, we're always already outside of ourselves. Like, I know that there's is his name David Lewis? No, that's not his name. It's something else. The guy who does like consciousness outside of you, right? Someone's probably seen his TED talk, right? Well, who's the philosopher who talks about the consciousness, extended consciousness, right? If you typed in to the search bar extended consciousness TED talk, you'll come up with the name of the contemporary philosopher that I'm thinking of. And basically he's talking about like, can we talk about like the consciousness of the phone, and the phone sort of having consciousness, but like as an extension of your consciousness? And all I'm saying is Heidegger was way ahead of this guy. And the point is that all of the equipment in the warehouse, or, in the workhouse, the workshop, all of the equipment in the workshop, if you're familiarized with it, you know what it's good for. If it's all a part of that assignment or assignment context, right? And it's all part of this referential totality of equipment. Then it's all like an extension of you and what your possibilities on the horizon of possibilities actually are, right? Lukács says it's almost like if you approach saving time as a technique in itself, then you are approaching this from the ass side. If you get your libido activated first, then you will somehow manage to save time, maybe in a stupid way first, but then you can jump to all of these techniques from books. And then you said Andy Clark? Is that where you were getting that, what you had just said, or is that from something else? No, you're saying, yeah, it's David Chalmers. Yeah, no, good job. Yeah, you figured it out. Yeah, the extended mind hypothesis is like being developed by David Chalmers. All I'm saying is that Dasein is like the extended mind body. It goes beyond mind and body. It goes beyond subject and object. And in fact, this worldhood that is constitutive for Dasein is a precondition for being able to compartmentalize things into subjects and objects and then treat them accordingly. Yeah. So anyway, the ecstasies, you're always kind of behind yourself. You're always out ahead of yourself. You're always even here in the present beside yourself. There's never a one-to-one identification. There's always like multiple things going on, and you're not just split, but you're also, temporally behind and ahead of yourself. And insofar as you're projecting possibilities of things that have already been onto the horizon, that's past and future. And so the now is just a clearing within which we're able to make sense of or theorize or interpret what's gone before as we try to take over, right, ownership of the way that we're projecting. And you can kind of just, once you realize that, still say, nah, I'm going to keep going with things, and I'm just going to kind of do as one does. And now you're still taking some more ownership of it once you realize what you're this sort of critical distance where the I is not me. Like there's not this one-to-one identification between me and myself. And the temporal unity of these ecstasies is getting at that stretched out across the spannedness of time, but also there's like the active part of it. Like it's not that we're just temporal beings. We're temporal beings who are always already temporalizing. Yeah. That's a good question. The ecstasies.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I wanted to bring something up because of the Ford presentation. Thank you, Anne. Erich Mühsam, and I don't know if you're familiar with it. Erich Mühsam wrote about automation too. He was an anarcho-communist from Germany. He was one of the first guys Hitler put into prison. And he wrote about this. And I can look it up if you are interested. I can look it up and also put it in the forum. Because I think he has maybe a different approach to this than Henry Ford does. Because he, like literally, while you're talking about it, he literally says it, that it will free us from work. I think he even puts it like that.
I see why he had to be put away.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
He was, and shout out to rest in peace, Erich Mühsam. And regarding this, I thought about Henry Ford's anti-Semitism. And funnily enough, I don't know so much about Heidegger yet. I'm still learning. But maybe there's like a weird similarity between the two in their anti-Semitism that I think for Henry Ford to be able to pursue this idea of the productive capital, for the people, class harmony, I think he needs his anti-Semitism for this. And he is in accordance with the Nazis because this is how the Nazis apologized or justified their capitalism, that they said, okay, we got rid of all the destructive capital. Yeah, the Jew is the destructive capital, and now we are only protective nation state. And I'm not so sure if this may be like Heidegger's historicity or historicality, I think, is what the term is. If he needs it for that too, to say like, okay, how did the Germans lose their historicality? I'm not sure if it's maybe this holds up that like, like to disavow the lack in the historicality itself. You need an unproductive historicality, which I think is what this is anti-Semitism. Yeah, the Jews are supposed to be rootless cosmopolitans who fuck up our nice relation to our soil because they have none. Like the.
Well, this is I think it's a lot easier to relate it to what is a lot more common today, though of course anti-Semitism makes its various comebacks, especially with the way people confuse the state of Israel and Jews. But no, there's this tendency these days to talk about whiteness. Well, why do we talk about whiteness? They used to talk about Jewry. Now we talk about whiteness. Why? Well, it's because white people are overrepresented in success. And so, of course, that's capitalist success. But you see, if it wasn't a white capitalism, if it was a black and rainbow capitalism, everything would be fine. The PMC has loved this line for 100 and some odd years. So this is like, it's people go, oh, it's so terrible to be anti-Semitic. Oh, it's the worst thing ever. Look at, there's a special kind of hatred. Yeah. Well, I don't know if anybody's tried being white and going to college, but like, it's okay to express open disdain for a person just because they're white. It is actually okay now. And in fact, you can have all kinds of penalties put on you, not just talking about in terms of affirmative action, but also depending on the spaces that you're in. You're either expected not to talk or you're expected to talk in a certain way. And if you don't, then you're outing yourself as one of the bad ones. And obviously the right wing reacts against this in cartoonishly stupid, non-productive ways. But it's a thing. This is definitely a thing. And it comes down to people ultimately thinking, look, there's something wrong. And there's all these spiritual reasons that things are wrong. And, there seems to be one group that's benefiting the most from this. And that one group that's benefiting the most from this, even though I know there's some of them are poor and some of them are working class and some of them are, but for the most part, most of them are there. I mean, it's like Ford says this at the beginning of his first book in the 4-volume project. He says, the one thing that you can say without a doubt about the Jew is that he is overrepresented in business. Or he said, like, he's all about business. And then he goes, I mean, he's like, not in every case, but in almost all cases, he is the most represented of any race. And then he goes into some numbers to pull it and it's just like, yeah, man, I think you've nailed it though. Like, this is how it's functioning. Like when Heidegger says Jewry, I think of, Ibram X. Kendi saying whiteness, and there's a similar function going on for them.
And this
which
is
it's a way of naturalizing. It's a way of naturalizing capital, is to say, well, if there was just more diversity in it, there'd be more to go around.
And this is what James Baldwin calls this the gates of paranoia. I don't know if anyone is familiar with James Baldwin. He was an African American writer, a gay guy from the hood, from the Bronx, when it was really ghetto, and he moved to France, and he has a whole, like, his standpoint is like he's not like the perfect black guy, because he attacked certain like black milieus for like homophobia, and he wrote an essay about it where he called it like the gates of paranoia, where he's like, okay, there is a lot of structural stuff regarding blackness, yeah, and like the marking of you are something else. And you're standing and like I think he compares it to like Kafka's gate of like the law. And so he does it implicitly, I think, not explicitly, but it's like, okay, there is something there, but you cannot really go beyond. So what happens to you is that you start to view everything through this lens. And he, like maybe this guy in, I don't know, the line in the supermarket to the cashier did not cut you off because he thought like, I hate this person because they are black. Maybe he's just an asshole. He's just an asshole to anybody, you know. And like, and this is the point he makes. Like I think it was late in his life he made that point.
Yeah, and that goes well with the scapegoating mechanism too, right? Yeah, exactly. And then that all goes together with the naturalizing the thing. Okay, really quick though, Philip, I know you're like on the other side of the house there. It's crazy. I've been in that house. It's so cool.
Yeah, and hopefully one day you'll return. There is actually like an interesting. There's a museum in Germany in a town called Sinsheim that has like a tech. It's got like 100,000 cars, not that many, but it's like tons of cars. And one of the things, like Henry Ford put fucking books inside the glove compartment of like stuff that you'll still hear like Nick Cannon saying about this whole Jews and banks and stuff. I just wanted to dialecticize this question we had from last week and say that certain activities will give and take based on our existence and its potential. Like I think I really like cigarettes, and I know on some level it might like end my being here, but it gives me energy, bro, and it like is something that is I wonder if we can think of it somehow like the exchange. Like we're engaged in this like exchange, and we might have this standing reserve, we might have like this little bit of savings, but the only way that we can like really lose a ton of time is to not invest in whatever that exchange is and just be like, no, I'm just saving this. I'm like almost like a miser, if that makes sense. Like that we're like, oh, I'm going to get this huge standing reserve of time. And then you're like 80 years old and like whatever, hollowed out, versus like when you're young getting after it, you're like, okay, I'm going to go out and do some kind of sport. I'll probably fuck up my body a little bit, but it's going to give me energy because we have that like certainty that Lacan talks about of death that makes life bearable.
Oh, right. Yeah, the certainty of death that makes life bearable. But can you go a little further with the analogy though of like, so maybe you could use another example. Like, so you're saying that like the cigarette, like ultimately it's going to kill you, but it also gives you energy. Are you saying that there's a lot of other things that we do that are like that?
Yeah, like you could, just like take your pick. It's all this trade-off that like in the a lot of people want to like sleep really well and be really alert during the day. So they'll take like these adaptogens at night, and they'll take these whatever like nootropic, like caffeine or something during the day. And it's like, like my brother told me once, like he's a jazz pianist and like smokes like a chimney, but he was just like, dude, caffeine is like the biggest thing keeping capitalism together. And I was like, what are you talking about, bro? And he was like, just stop doing caffeine, full stop, period. You're going to feel way, way different about like the need to be a productive ant or whatever. And I was like, I tried it and he's not wrong. And the amount of people that so that's what I'm talking about. It's like, oh, I need to get this energy now. So we're dealing with energy across time and just trying to make it like a geometrical question. That's like, there's no one thing that will give or take my energy. Everything I engage with is a give and take.
Mm.
And then it's like, okay,
but what was the connection to the miser thing when you're old?
The miser thing to me is like, people get into this dogmatic way of thinking that's like, if I do yoga, I am saving myself time. If I do tantric sex, I am saving myself time. Like, whatever, like insert whatever, versus being like, no, actually, just about everything we do is like, yeah, it might save you some. It'll probably cost you some. And it's more about this exchange so that we can move kind of from this particular pre-given to a singular, thing that works for the subject. So that they're like, oh, fuck, I have to actually like go out and try stuff. Like, so we move more and more towards this radical experimentation. And it'll probably lead to new grounds of being that people are just like, dude, working under fluorescence for 8 hours a day, even though it gives you a little extra money. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're done.
It's bad. It sucks. It's like I want to wear sunglasses at Amazon because of those lights, So I think everyone will hopefully keep thinking about this. If you want to stay after, if y'all want to talk, I'll pass it off here to Rudy, and y'all can hang out and talk longer because I do gotta go. But I just want to say, like, we're gonna get into this a lot more next week on Sunday, right? And I think this is a useful point, Philip. Now, there's different kinds of energy. And I'm not talking about libidinal versus physical. There's intellectual, creative, social, emotional, and physical kinds of energy. That's just 5 I listed off. And I think it's arguably like the most important 5, unless you want to bring in some kind of spiritual energy. And then you could talk about the way that these are or are not libidinal. And you could talk about the ways that they are or are not for different people in different contexts and situations. But ultimately, I am kind of assuming nobody's thought about the problems that we're thinking about, the way that we're approaching them. And so that's why your experiments and how you're thinking about these things really does matter. Like, I know some people like are gonna, oh, well, who am I to be doing this research? Who the fuck are you not to be doing it? Right? We got to do it. It's on us. And so with that, thank you, everybody. I'm out of here. I'm gonna go upload this piece.